The morning began the way mornings at the Burrow always did. Not with silence, not with slow stretches and gentle calm, but with a kind of cheerful disorder that felt as natural as breathing. It wasn't the sort of chaos that meant anything was wrong. It was the familiar kind. The kind built from too many people in one crooked, beloved house, all moving through the same small rooms with different intentions at the same time. The Burrow had never been tidy in the way the ministry offices were tidy, or the way Percy wished it could be tidy. It was tidy in its own way. It held together by love, by routine, by the steady rhythm of a family that knew each other so well they could argue without breaking. Ron sat at the kitchen table, his chair angled slightly back because one of the legs never quite matched the others. He had a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him, and he was doing something that looked, at first glance, like eating. But Molly Weasley didn't need to glance. "Ronald," she said, voice firm without being sharp, "you're not eating." Ron lifted his fork immediately, as if he'd been caught doing something criminal. "I am eating." Molly didn't even turn around. She was at the stove, one hand working a pan, the other reaching for something on the counter, and her eyes were on none of them, and all of them at once. "You're rearranging." "That's not the same thing." Ron opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again, because she was right. And the most irritating part about Molly Weasley was how often she was right. Percy sat upright across the table, shoulders straight the way he'd trained them to be, as if posture itself was proof of moral character. He was talking. He had been talking for a while, about quill maintenance, because a proper point isn't only about neat handwriting, Percy was saying. Tone patient in the way he used when he believed he was doing someone a favor. It's about discipline. If you let your quill split, you're telling the world you don't respect your own work. Ron pushed his eggs into a new shape, a small hill where there had been a flat field. "I respect my work," he muttered. Percy either didn't hear him or chose not to. "And if you clean the nib correctly and store it properly, you prevent blotting. Blotting ruins everything. It ruins clarity. It ruins readability. And it ruins breakfast," Fred murmured, voice light, like he'd dropped the words onto the table on purpose, and then stepped back to watch them roll. George, beside Fred, lifted an eyebrow in agreement. They were doing what they often did when Percy took hold of a subject, letting him speak until he ran out of steam, then quietly making each other laugh without interrupting him directly. It wasn't kindness, exactly. It was a kind of family strategy. Percy would say what he needed to say either way. This way, everyone survived it. Ginny sat near the end of the table, her feet swinging beneath her chair. She tapped the chair legs with the heels of her shoes, not in a steady beat, but in a restless rhythm that matched the movement of her thoughts more than anything musical. Her face was set in that careful expression she wore when she wanted to look older than she was. Chin slightly raised, mouth neutral, eyes watching everything as if she was memorizing it. Molly moved between the stove and the table with swift efficiency. A plate floated gently across the room, at the flick of her wand, landing in front of Fred. A cup refilled itself. The kettle hissed. A piece of toast popped up, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. "Eat properly," Molly said, setting down a teapot with the kind of deliberate weight that made the cups tremble just slightly. "Growing boys need a proper breakfast." Ron frowned. "I'm eating. You're rearranging," she repeated, and Ron sighed as if his suffering was enormous. Fred looked at George and made a small, almost invisible gesture with his fingers. George responded with a tiny nod. Ron saw it out of the corner of his eye and felt the familiar pinch of suspicion in his stomach. They were planning something. They were always planning something. He tried to ignore them and focused on his plate, because that was easier than asking questions and getting answers that were half truth and half amusement. And then the window filled with wings. It happened so cleanly, so suddenly. that the whole kitchen seemed to pause in the moment between one breath and the next. A school owl glided in, official-looking, neat, with a steady gaze that didn't waver. It didn't circle. It didn't hesitate. It didn't perch on a chair back like Errol would have done with all the grace of a falling sack. It flew straight to the table and dropped a thick envelope directly into Ron's plate. The parchment landed with a wet plop. Egg yolk splattered. For half a second, nothing moved. It was as if the entire burrow had decided to hold its breath at the same time. Fred and George stopped mid-gesture. Percy's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. Ginny's feet went still, heels hovering above the chair legs. Molly's hand rose to her throat in a reflex she didn't seem to notice herself doing. Ron stared at the envelope. The eggs had stained it, that the address, written in emerald green ink, was crisp and sharp, untouched by the mess around it, as if the words carried their own protection. Mr. R. Weasley. The kitchen table, the burrow, ottery, St. Catchpole, Devon, Ron's fingers, went cold and hot at once. His stomach dipped, the way it did when you stepped onto a broom and the ground fell away beneath you. He knew what it was. He had known for years. In the same quiet way you knew the seasons would change and birthdays would arrive, whether you wanted them to or not. But knowing wasn't the same as seeing it sitting there on his plate, like a piece of his future had been dropped into his breakfast. "Go on, then," Fred said softly. Ron looked up, startled by the gentleness in his voice. Fred's expression was still Fred's, mischief tucked behind it, ready to return. But there was something else there too, pride maybe. Or a kind of recognition. Like this mattered even to them, even if they would tease him about it later. George nodded once, just as quiet. "Open it." Ron swallowed. He lifted the envelope carefully, as if it might tear, as if he might wake up and find it was only a dream. The seal on the back bore the Hogwarts crest. The wax was deep red, pressed with the familiar animals: lion, badger, eagle, serpent. Ron traced them with his thumb without thinking. Somewhere in that castle, there was a hat that would look inside him and decide where he belonged. The thought made his stomach twist. Fear and excitement tangled so tightly he couldn't tell which was which. He broke the seal. The parchment unfolded with a crisp crackle that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. Ron's eyes skimmed words he had heard read aloud so many times they almost felt like a song. 5 brothers, 5 identical letters. Stories told at the table, repeated in the garden, argued about upstairs when the twins were bored. But this time, it wasn't Bill's letter. It wasn't Charlie's, it wasn't Percy's or Fred's or George's. It was his. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The words seemed to lift off the page and settle into Ron's chest. Molly made a sound that cracked the silence. It was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, but it carried both. "Oh, oh, my baby," she cried. Then she was across the room in 2 steps, arms wrapping around Ron with a bone-crushing hug that knocked his chair backward. Ron's breath left him in a wheeze. "Mom, can't breathe," he managed. "Let him have his lungs, Molly." Arthur Weasley's voice came from the doorway. Ron hadn't heard the door open, but there Arthur stood, hair slightly mussed, tie loosened, his eyes warm with a kind of amusement that wasn't mocking, just fond. "He'll need those for first year," Arthur added. Molly released Ron just enough to look at him, hands still on his shoulders, like she needed the contact to keep herself steady. "I can't believe it," she said, eyes bright with tears. Ron, off to Hogwarts." "I'm 11, Ron muttered, cheeks burning. "Exactly," George said, brightness returning like sunlight after cloud. "Ancient, positively decrepit, Fred added. We were starting to think you'd never make it. Stuck at primary school forever, George continued, as if this was a tragedy of epic proportions. A fate worse than death, Fred finished. Enough, Molly snapped. But she was smiling through her tears. Percy cleared his throat, straightened his spine, and took on the tone he used when he felt history was happening and he wanted to be appropriately official about it. Congratulations, Ron, he said. I trust you'll take your studies seriously and bring honor to the Weasley name. As a prefect, I can offer guidance on— Yeah, Fred cut in. Percy, we know. We know you're important, George added. Vitally important, Fred said. Crucially important, George agreed. The most important person to ever. Fred paused thoughtfully. Import, George finished, pleased with himself. Percy's ears went pink. That doesn't even make sense. It makes perfect sense, Fred said with a straight face that fooled no one. It's just too intelligent for ordinary people. Molly turned back to Ron, cupping his face between her palms, as if he were still small enough to lift. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Ron squirmed. The letter just comes. It still means something, Molly said, and kissed his forehead. The kiss was warm, and for a second Ron felt about 6 years old again, standing on a stool to reach the counter, asking for jam. And then, from the far end of the table, Ginny's voice cut in. What about me? The words were sharp, but the feelings under them were tender and raw. The entire kitchen shifted, as if everyone had stepped onto thin ice and felt it creak. Molly's face softened immediately. Oh, Ginny, love. It's fine, Ginny said quickly. Too quickly. Her mouth made a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm happy for him. Really. Ron looked at his sister. He knew that expression. He'd seen it when Percy got his prefect badge. When Charlie came home with Quidditch stories that made the whole house feel louder. When Bill talked about Egypt and curses and brilliant impossible things. Ginny was always waiting. Always watching. Always 1 year behind. Arthur moved behind her chair and rested his hands gently on her shoulders. Next year, he said softly. You'll get yours next year. I know, Ginny replied, swallowing, and Ron will write to me, so I'll be prepared. Right? Ron nodded quickly. Yeah. I'll write loads. Ginny's smile became slightly more real. You'd better. I want everything. Which house you get. What the food's like. If the ghosts are actually see-through. Oh, they're see-through, Fred said. Especially nearly headless Nick, George added. Because his head's nearly off, Fred explained cheerfully. George, Molly snapped. No gruesome talk at breakfast. It's not gruesome, George said, offended. It's educational. Arthur picked up Ron's letter and read further, his expression shifting into that thoughtful look he got when he was doing sums in his head without wanting anyone to see. We'll need to visit Diagon Alley soon, Arthur said. Molly already had a piece of parchment out, as if it had been waiting in her apron pocket for this exact moment. I've started a list. Ron's chest tightened. He glanced down at the letter beside his plate. Egg-stained, yes, but still shining with promise. I don't need new things, he said quickly. Second hand's fine. Arthur looked at him steadily. You'll have what you need. Ron opened his mouth to argue again, but Arthur's voice carried a quiet finality that didn't feel like a command so much as a promise. Every Weasley boy gets what he needs for school, Arthur said. Ron blinked hard and nodded once, because if he spoke, his voice might do something embarrassing. The kitchen slowly returned to sound. Percy began talking again, though less loudly. The twins started whispering to each other again, their expressions softening in a way Ron didn't see often. Molly bustled, doing dishes with swift wand-work, because action was easier than sitting with feeling. Ginny's feet started swinging again, though slower, as if she was trying to settle herself. Ron sat with the letter in his hands and let the weight of it sink in. Not just the parchment. The meaning. Hogwarts wasn't just a word in his brother's stories anymore. It wasn't a thing he listened to from the bottom of the stairs.
It wasn't a dream that belonged to everyone else.
It was his. Now. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear, beneath the doubt, something small and bright began to unfold. The tiniest spark of readiness. After the owl's wings had vanished back through the open window, the kitchen took a moment to remember how to move again. It returned to life the way a fire returns after someone has stirred the coals. Slowly at first, then all at once. Cups clinked. Cutlery scraped softly against plates. The kettle released a thin hiss. Someone's chair legs squeaked as they shifted. Molly's wand made the dishes float in a tidy line towards the sink, and the small domestic magic of it should have felt ordinary. But nothing was ordinary anymore. Not really. Ron sat with the letter folded in his hands, the heavy parchment slightly damp from egg yolk, as if the burrow itself had tried to baptize it into reality. The Hogwarts crest sat on the back like a stamp of fate. He kept touching it without thinking, thumb running over the raised edges of the lion and the serpent and the eagle and the badger, as though the texture might explain what the next part of his life would feel like. He'd seen those animals 100 times. On his brother's letters, on old school things they'd brought home, on the occasional book cover. They'd always seemed distant, like symbols in a story. Now they were pressed into his own future. Percy, unable to let the moment remain emotional without adding structure, leaned toward Ron with the air of someone about to deliver a lecture. "You'll want to respond promptly," Percy said, smoothing an invisible wrinkle in his robes. "It's proper. You should send your acceptance immediately. McGonagall will appreciate punctuality." "It's automatic," Fred muttered, reaching for another slice of toast. "The school doesn't wait for you to say yes, Percy. They already assume you're coming." "Because who wouldn't?" George added. "Hogwarts is a delight. Educational. Character building. Full of friendly staff and entirely safe corridors." Percy narrowed his eyes. "Don't you start." "We weren't going to start," Fred said innocently, the way he said innocent things when he was absolutely guilty. "We were going to continue. There is a difference." Molly shot them a look sharp enough to slice bread. "Not today." The twins lifted their hands as if surrendering, but their grins remained. They were in that dangerous state of being both pleased and restrained, the kind that usually meant they had stored up their mischief and were waiting for a better moment to release it. Arthur sat at the table now, newspaper folded and forgotten, his eyes drifting over Ron's letter with the expression of someone seeing two things at once. Pride, clearly, bright in the soft crinkles at the corners of his eyes. But behind it, a quiet calculation, the kind that lived in every parent's mind when they were trying to make a small pile of money stretch far enough to cover a big moment. Ron noticed it, because Ron had always noticed those things, even when he didn't want to. It was part of being the sixth son, part of growing up in a house where you learned early what economical meant, without anyone saying it aloud. Molly returned to the table and sat down at last, though she didn't really sit so much as perch, as if she might spring back up at any second if something needed doing. She reached for the letter again, eyes scanning it as though it might have changed since Ron opened it. "It's real," she whispered. "Yes, Mum," Ron said, voice small. Molly's mouth trembled. "I know. Sometimes you spend years waiting for something, and when it arrives you feel as if you're not ready for it to be real." Ron didn't know what to say to that, because he felt the same way but didn't have the words. He swallowed and stared down at his plate. The eggs had gone cold, but he forced himself to eat a few bites anyway, because his mother would notice if he didn't, and because it felt like the correct thing to do, as if eating was proof that life was still normal. Ginny reached across the table and poked the edge of the parchment with one finger, as if she couldn't help herself. The movement was careful, reverent. Ron watched her, seeing the way her face softened despite her effort to look composed. "Can I read it?" she asked quietly. Ron slid it over to her without hesitation. Ginny took it with both hands, eyes moving slowly, taking in every line even though she already knew what it said. Ron could tell she wasn't just reading the words. She was reading the dream behind them, the future, the belonging. He felt a sting of something in his chest. Guilt, maybe, or tenderness, or the strange ache of realizing you had something someone else wanted badly and couldn't have yet. He leaned toward her slightly and lowered his voice. "Next year?" he said, as if he could make it more solid by speaking it. Ginny's mouth tightened. Then she nodded once, sharp and determined. "Next year," she echoed, like a promise she was making to herself more than anyone else. Percy, deciding the emotional portion of the morning had lasted long enough, cleared his throat again. "Now," he said, "we should discuss practicalities." Fred groaned loudly. Yes. Percy's favorite part of joy. Practicalities. George clasped his hands dramatically. "Let us gather, children, and hear of the sacred scrolls of practicalities." Percy ignored them. "You'll need to study in advance, Ronald. Hogwarts is rigorous. Students are expected to arrive with a basic understanding of wizarding history, foundational magical theory, and—" Ron blinked. "Expected to— what? I thought they teach you." I had no one to know why. "They teach you," Percy said, as if Ron had suggested Hogwarts would feed him with a spoon. "But it's wise to prepare. You don't want to start behind." Fred leaned toward Ron, voice conspiratorial. "Percy read 3 textbooks before he even got on the train," George added, "and then he read them again on the train, just in case the words had changed." "I was enthusiastic," Percy snapped, "and I excelled." "You did," Arthur said gently, and Ron felt his father's tone shift into that careful balance of encouragement and peacekeeping. "Percy's right that a bit of preparation is helpful, but Ron, you don't need to memorize your entire first year before September." "I'm not going to," Ron said quickly, because the idea sounded exhausting. Molly patted his hand, as if reassuring herself. "You'll learn what you need when you get there. You've grown up around magic. You'll be fine." Ron wanted to believe her. He wanted to have the kind of steady confidence Bill had worn like a cloak, or the kind of bold ease Charlie carried, or even Percy's tightly controlled certainty. But sitting there, letter in hand, he felt the world beyond the burrow, looming in his mind like a castle made of shadow and light. He didn't say that, though. He didn't want to make her worry more than she already was. Instead, he asked the question that had been circling his thoughts since the owl arrived. "Do you think," he hesitated, "do you think I'll be Gryffindor?" The words fell into the kitchen like a pebble dropped into still water. The twins paused. Percy stopped adjusting his sleeves. Ginny looked up from the letter. Molly's hands stilled on the table. Even Arthur's expression shifted, softening into something thoughtful. Ron had not meant to make the room quiet. He hadn't meant to turn it into a moment. But it was a moment, whether he wanted it or not. Fred spoke first, because Fred always spoke first when there was silence. "Probably," Fred said. "You've got the hair for it." George nodded solemnly. "And the freckles." "Very Gryffindor." "That's not how it works," Percy muttered. but his voice lacked its usual bite. He looked, for once, a little uncertain, as if he remembered what it felt like to be the one waiting for the hat's decision. Arthur leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "It's hard to say," he said. "The sorting hat isn't mechanical. It's not a checklist," Molly added softly. "It sees you." Ron's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "What if it doesn't? What if it sees that I'm—" He stopped. Ordinary. He didn't want to say it out loud. Saying it would make it true. Molly's eyes locked on his face, like she could hear the word anyway. She reached out and took his hand. "Ronald," she said firmly, and there was love in the firmness, like a blanket pulled up around you even when you protested. "You are not ordinary." Ron's face heated. "I mean it," she continued, not letting him wriggle away with embarrassment. "You've got your father's kindness, and you've got courage in you whether you see it yet or not. You've got a way of making people laugh, and you've got a heart. Here we go." Fred whispered to George, but his eyes were gentle, not mocking. Molly ignored him. "And that matters, Ron. Do you hear me? It matters more than being top of the class, or being the bravest, or being the loudest." Ron didn't know what to do with that, so he nodded and stared at his plate, blinking hard. Arthur reached for the letter again, as if to give the moment somewhere else to rest. "We should look at the list," he said, voice practical but kind. Ron was grateful for the shift. He pulled out the second sheet of parchment, the one covered in neat print that listed everything a first year needed. He scanned it, heart sinking and rising at the same time. Books, robes, potions, supplies, a cauldron, a wand. He had the sudden sharp memory of standing in Ollivander's, the way the shop smelled like wood and dust and magic. He hadn't been in there often. None of them had, because wands were expensive and important, and not something you replaced lightly. The thought of his wand, the one that would choose him, sent a twist of excitement through him, so strong it almost hurt. "That's a lot," Ron said before he could stop himself. Molly immediately sat up straighter, as if she could physically block the worry from reaching him. "We'll manage," she said briskly. Arthur's mouth twitched. "We always do." Percy, ever eager to be helpful in the way he thought was best, pointed at the book list. "You can have my old copies," he said. "They're in excellent condition. I kept them properly. I also took thorough notes." Fred's face twisted, as if he'd tasted something unpleasant. Percy's notes. A thrilling inheritance. George nodded gravely. A treasure trove of margin commentary. Ron looked at Percy, and despite the usual irritation Percy inspired, he felt a rush of gratitude. Percy was annoying, yes. Percy was pompous. But Percy was offering what he could offer, in the language he knew. "Thanks," Ron said quietly. "Really?" Percy's chest puffed slightly, pleased. "Of course. It's important to support one's younger siblings academically." Molly began making noises about robes, about letting hems down, about using Bill's old cauldron if it still held water. Her voice was brisk, but her hands trembled slightly whenever she reached for something. Ron watched her and felt that familiar mixture of love and guilt again. She was trying to hold it together by organizing, by making lists, because lists were safer than tears. Ginny, still holding the letter, looked up abruptly. "Can I come to Diagon Alley?" she asked, voice bright in that forced way Ron recognized. Molly's face flickered. Oh, Ginny. Arthur hesitated too, just long enough for the truth to show itself. It wasn't only about car space or practicality. It was about letting Ginny see the world she wanted so badly while she had to stay behind. It'll be crowded, Molly said carefully. And you'll be tired and... It's fine, Ginny said quickly, the brightness hardening. I don't mind. Really. I can stay and help at home. Ron felt his chest ache again. He glanced at Arthur, hoping his dad might say something that would fix it. But Arthur looked caught between wanting to protect Ginny and wanting to make Ron's day as smooth as possible. Fred and George, unusually quiet, exchanged a look, not a prank look, something else. Ron leaned toward Ginny. We'll bring you back something, he said. Something brilliant. Anything you want. Ginny's eyes sharpened, fierce. I want you to get everything you need. Ron blinked. I want you to have the best first year, Ginny continued, voice steady now, as if she'd decided what she was going to feel and was sticking to it. That's what I want. Molly made a soft sound and turned away abruptly, busying herself with the teapot again, though the tea was already poured. Arthur reached over and squeezed Ginny's shoulder. Next year, he said again. Ginny nodded once. Next year, Ron. Looked down at the book list again. Then at the section that mentioned the train. September 1st. King's Cross Station. Platform 9 3/4. He'd heard about it so many times, it almost felt like a story he'd invented in his head. The hidden barrier. The rush through the wall. The steam and the scarlet train. The first glimpse of other children his age, who also knew magic was real. But now it wasn't a story. It was a date, a place, a real thing that would happen to him. Arthur's voice softened as he read. I remember my first time, he said, almost to himself. I thought I was going to run straight into the wall. But you didn't, Ron said quietly. But you didn't, Ron said quietly. Arthur smiled. No, your grandfather gave me a push. Literally. Ron pictured it, and for some reason the image made his throat tighten. The idea of being pushed into the unknown by someone who loved you enough to believe you'd survive it. The kitchen slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Fred and George began whispering again, but their laughter was gentler now. Percy resumed his commentary, though he sounded less like a lecture and more like someone trying to be helpful. Ginny's feet started tapping again. Not restless now, but thoughtful, like she was counting down days in her head, and Ron sat there, letter beside his plate, and let the feeling settle. He wasn't just Ron Weasley, the youngest at home, the one who watched his brothers go and come back with stories. He was Ron Weasley, who had been invited into something vast. Fear still lived in him, coiled tight. But beneath it, there was a spark. Small, bright, stubborn. A sense that maybe, just maybe, he could step through the barrier too. By the time breakfast drifted toward its usual end, plates scraped clean, cups refilled, Percy still talking because Percy always talked, the letter had settled into the kitchen like a new piece of furniture, not in the way it took up space, but in the way it changed how everyone moved around it. Ron kept glancing at it as if it might vanish when he wasn't watching. Molly kept glancing at Ron as if she was trying to memorize his face before it belonged partly to somewhere else. Arthur kept reading and rereading the list, his expression soft, his eyes kind, his mind doing sums no one asked him to do out loud. Percy looked pleased in the way he looked when something important confirmed his belief that proper systems mattered. Hogwarts was a system. Hogwarts had rules. Hogwarts had structure. Percy trusted those things. Fred and George trusted almost nothing, except their own ability to turn any structure into a game. Ginny trusted the letter, but she also resented it, in a quiet, complicated way that she would never admit to, because she loved Ron too much to want his joy smaller, just so hers could feel safer. It was an ordinary morning in every small detail. And it wasn't ordinary at all. Molly stood, waved her wand once, and the dishes lifted from the table in a neat line, floating toward the sink. Ron watched the plates drift by and thought, suddenly, of all the times he'd watched magic like that, and never really registered it as magic. It was just Mum doing things. Just the house running the way it always ran. At Hogwarts, magic wouldn't be background noise. It would be the point of everything. It would be measured and graded and corrected in red ink. The thought made him sit a little straighter without meaning to. "All right," Molly said briskly, clapping her hands once, as if she could summon focus the way she summoned teacups. "We'll need to plan the Diagon Alley trip properly." Fred perked up immediately. "Properly," she says. George nodded solemnly. "That means lists." "We need lists," Molly said, as if Fred and George hadn't spoken at all. "And timing. Because if we do it in a rush, we forget something, and then we have to come back, and that wastes money, and Ronald, stop fidgeting." "I'm not fidgeting," Ron lied automatically. "You're vibrating," Molly said. Ron tried to stop vibrating. It didn't work. Arthur folded the book list carefully and tucked it beside the letter. His movements were slow and deliberate, like he was handling something fragile. "We'll go soon," Arthur said, voice gentle. "Before everything gets too crowded. Before everything gets too expensive," Ron heard himself say without thinking. The words slipped out, and immediately he wished he could pull them back in. Molly's head snapped up. "Ronald." Ron felt his ears burn. "I didn't mean. I know it costs a lot and I don't want." Arthur raised a hand not to stop him but to soften the panic. "Ron," he said, quietly, "you don't need to carry that." "I can, though," Ron muttered, staring at the table. "I'm not stupid." "I know you're not," Arthur said. There was a beat of silence, and in that beat, Ron understood something that made his throat tighten. His father wasn't angry. His father wasn't even surprised. He was just sad that Ron felt the need to say it at all. Molly sat down again, and her voice softened in the way it did when she was trying to be careful. "We manage," she said. "We always have. We always will." Ron nodded, but his stomach still felt tight. Percy, perhaps sensing that the mood had shifted in a direction he didn't know how to handle, decided to yank it back toward something he could control. "As I said," Percy began, tone regaining confidence, "it's not only about purchasing supplies, it's about preparation. Ron should be familiar with the school's academic expectations. I can provide him with—" "Percy," Molly said, warning in her voice. Percy's mouth snapped shut. Fred leaned back and laced his hands behind his head, grinning at the ceiling as if it had personally entertained him. "If Ron wants expectations," he said lazily, "we can provide expectations." George's grin matched his. Very realistic expectations. Ron squinted at them. "Don't." "We're not saying anything," Fred said innocently. "We're just being supportive," George added. Arthur sighed, already resigned. "Please, for once," Try supportive without being alarming. We can do that, Fred promised. We absolutely can, George agreed. Ron didn't believe them for a second. Molly continued talking, because Molly did best when she had something to organize. We can use Bill's old cauldron, she said, tapping her list with her quill, and Percy's spare set of quills, if they're still in decent condition. Your robes, well, there are robes that can be let down. I don't mind, Ron said quickly. Really. It doesn't have to be new. Molly's eyes softened. Sweetheart, you deserve proper things. Arthur cleared his throat gently. He'll have proper things, he said. Proper doesn't have to mean shiny. Molly huffed a laugh that wasn't quite a laugh. No. Proper can mean patched and mended, and still perfectly good. But it will be clean, and it will fit, and it will last. Ron swallowed. He wanted to argue, to insist he didn't care, because insisting felt like control. But he knew his parents. He knew the way they would quietly sacrifice their own small comforts to make sure he had what he needed. He knew that refusing wouldn't actually change the money. It would only make them feel as though he was ashamed. And he wasn't ashamed. He was just scared. Ginny, still holding the letter, folded it carefully and pushed it back toward Ron. Keep it safe, she said softly. Ron took it, surprised by the steadiness in her tone. When he looked up, Ginny was watching him with something like seriousness. Older than 10, older than the freckles across her nose, and the way her hair sometimes stuck out in wild angles when she'd been running. You're going to write to me, she said. Ron tried to smile. I said I would. I mean it, Ginny continued. Not just, everything is fine. I want details. I'll write, Ron promised. Ginny narrowed her eyes. Every week, Ron blinked. Every week. Ginny's gaze didn't waver. Every week. And if you miss one, I'll know. Fred leaned forward, delighted. Listen to her. George nodded appreciatively. Tiny tyrant. Oi, Ginny snapped, but her mouth twitched. Molly looked relieved to have Ginny engaged in something that wasn't pain. Your sister's right, she said. Letters matter. When you're away, it's how we stay close. Ron nodded, and he meant it. He could already picture himself at Hogwarts, sitting at some long table or on some old sofa by a fire, writing home with ink that smelled like books and castle stone and new beginnings. Or maybe he'd be too busy. Maybe he'd forget. Maybe he'd come home at Christmas and realize he hadn't written half as much as he promised. The thought made him feel guilty already. But he'd try. He would. Because Ginny looked like she was gripping that promise like a rope. Breakfast ended the way Burrow breakfasts usually ended, with people scattering. Percy swept his dishes into the sink with the air of someone doing something noble, then left the room with a rustle of robes and purposeful indignation. I'm going to write to Penelope, he announced, as if the world required notification. Fred clapped slowly. A historic announcement, George added. Tell her you've taught us everything we know. Percy stopped in the doorway. I have. Fred's grin widened. And look how well that's worked out. Percy left with a huff. The door clicked behind him. The twins burst into laughter, the sound loud and familiar, and somehow comforting. Molly began wiping down the table, even though it was already clean by normal standards. Arthur picked up his newspaper again, but didn't unfold it properly. He sat with it in front of him, gaze drifting towards Ron, with that quiet, thoughtful expression that made Ron feel both safe and exposed. Ron held the letter in his hands. and stared at it until the words blurred. Hogwarts. It was like a door opening somewhere in his mind, a door that led to something enormous. Ron, Arthur said gently. Ron looked up. Arthur pointed at the list. Read it out, he said. Let's see what you need. Ron cleared his throat and began. One wand. The words felt strange in his mouth. Official. Real. One cauldron, pewter, standard size. 2. Molly nodded, already thinking about where Bill's cauldron might be. 1 set of glass or crystal vials. Molly murmured something about wrapping them properly. Ron kept reading. The books sounded like the heaviest part, not physically, though they would be heavy, but in the way their titles carried the promise of a world Ron had only glimpsed. The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. A History of Magic. Magical Theory. Transfiguration. A Beginner's Guide. Ron's voice wobbled slightly on that last one, because transfiguration was the kind of magic that sounded impossible, turning one thing into another, changing reality with intent and focus. He'd watched his mother do small transformations all his life, mending cloth, repairing dishes, keeping the house from falling apart, but the idea of being asked to do it in a classroom with a professor watching made his palms sweat. Arthur's eyes crinkled. Sounds intimidating, Arthur said, as if Ron had read his thoughts. But you'll learn. Everyone does. Fred leaned across the table and tapped the parchment with one finger. Don't worry, he said. You'll be brilliant. Ron frowned, suspicious. That sounded sincere. George nodded. It was. Ron stared at them. Ooh, ooh, ooh. What's the catch? Fred spread his hands. No catch. George added, We're allowed to be nice sometimes. Ron didn't know what to do with that. It made his chest feel oddly tight. Molly, hearing something like kindness in the twins' tone, softened and returned her attention to Ron. And what about your trunk? She asked. Your school trunk. You need a proper one. I can use Bill's, Ron offered quickly. Molly sighed. Bill's is falling apart at the hinges. I don't care, Ron insisted. Arthur leaned back, thinking. We can find one, he said. Second-hand, perhaps. Ron nodded, grateful for the word second-hand being spoken without shame. Ginny leaned her head slightly to one side. Do you think you'll be on the train with other first years? She asked. Ron blinked. I think so. Fred nodded sagely. Oh, yes. You'll meet them on the train. George added, You'll sit in a compartment, and you'll pretend you're not nervous. Ron swallowed. What if I don't meet anyone? Fred looked genuinely surprised. Ron, it's a train full of children. George nodded. You'll meet someone? Ron stared down at the letter, and his voice dropped. What if they're all different? Like, what if they're all clever or confident or... Molly's hand landed on his shoulder. Most of them will be nervous, she said softly. Just like you. Arthur nodded. And the ones who aren't nervous are probably pretending. Fred snapped his fingers. Exactly. George pointed at Ron. A life lesson. Everyone's faking it. Until they aren't. Ron tried to breathe, tried to let that settle. He wasn't the only one. Of course he wasn't. But it still felt like a cliff. After a while, Molly folded her list and tucked it into her apron pocket, satisfied with the initial planning stage. Right, she said briskly, as if briskness could keep emotions contained. I've got errands in the village. Arthur, you're working today, and you boys, we're innocent, Fred said immediately. George nodded, utterly harmless. Molly's eyes narrowed. That means you're about to do something. Fred looked offended. Mum, please, we would never. Molly sighed. Just don't do anything that will require me to spend my afternoon reversing a hex. Fred smiled sweetly. No promises. Molly raised her wand. Fred took a quick step back. Kidding. Kidding. Promises. All the promises. Molly huffed, then turned to Ron. You all right, love? She asked quietly, the briskness dropping away. Ron hesitated. He could say yes. He could keep it simple. But something in him was tired of pretending. Tired of holding everything in so he didn't seem weak. He swallowed. I don't know, he admitted. I'm excited. And I'm scared. Molly's expression softened completely. All mother now, all warmth. That's exactly how you're supposed to feel, she said. If you weren't scared, you wouldn't understand how big this is. And if you weren't excited, she smiled, well, then it wouldn't be you. Ron's throat tightened. What if I'm rubbish at it? He asked, voice small. What if everyone else knows things I don't? And I'm just... He couldn't finish. Ordinary. Molly cupped his cheek again, thumb brushing the freckle beside his nose. Ronald Bilius Weasley, she said, voice gentle but steady. Listen to me. You are not rubbish. You are not ordinary. You are you, and that is more than enough. Ron blinked hard. Arthur stood, coming around the table, and rested a hand on Ron's other shoulder. You know what courage is? Arthur asked. Ron sniffed. Charging into dragons? Charlie would say yes. But Arthur smiled slightly. Courage is getting on the train even when your stomach feels like it's trying to crawl out of you. Ron let out a shaky laugh. Arthur squeezed his shoulder. You'll do it. And then one day, you'll be the one telling Ginny what it's like. Ginny, from the doorway, rolled her eyes. As if I won't already know everything, because he's going to write to me every week. Ron managed a real smile at that. I will, he said, and meant it. Molly kissed his forehead again, then stood up as if staying still too long might let her cry. Finish your breakfast, she ordered, properly, and then go outside. Get some air. Yes, Mum, Ron said automatically. Molly and Arthur left together, Arthur pausing to straighten Molly's apron tie in a small, absent-minded gesture that made Ron's chest ache with affection. Ginny lingered for a moment, watching Ron with that fierce little determination again. You're going to be brilliant, she said. Ron snorted. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true, Ginny replied, and then she turned and went outside, leaving Ron alone with the letter and the quiet. Ron stared at the eggs on his plate. They were cold and not very appealing anymore, but he ate them anyway, not because he wanted them, but because it felt like a small act of control. One normal thing he could still do. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully as he'd seen Percy fold anything important, and tucked it into his pocket. It felt heavy there, like a stone that anchored him to something real. He stepped out into the garden. The burrow leaned in the sunlight, crooked and warm, looking the same as it always had. The chickens scratched in the dirt. The gnomes lurked near the garden patch, as if plotting small crimes. Somewhere above, there was the faint sound of laughter. Fred and George, already up to something. Ron inhaled deeply. The air smelled like grass and earth, and the faint sweetness of late summer. It smelled like home. And for the first time since the owl arrived, Ron let himself feel it fully, the way the letter had changed him, even though he still stood in the same garden with the same view. The fear was still there, but underneath it, the spark had grown. Not confidence exactly, something quieter. A willingness to step forward, even if his knees shook. He looked toward the house, toward the window where the owl had flown in, toward the kitchen table where he'd opened his future with trembling hands. Hogwarts was coming, soon. And somehow, that thought, terrifying as it was, made his heart lift. The days after the letter arrived did not change the burrow's habits. The house still woke up before the sun was fully awake. The kitchen still filled with clattering and voices and Molly's determined efficiency. The garden still tried to become a wilderness if no one watched it closely. Fred and George still moved through the rooms, as if the house belonged to them, and the laws of nature were merely polite suggestions. But for Ron, everything felt slightly tilted, like he'd stepped half an inch to the side of his own life and was looking at it from a new angle. He'd always known Hogwarts would come. He'd always known the letter would arrive. And yet, now that it had, time did something strange. It hurried and dragged at the same time. He would wake up in the morning and think, 2 months, and it would feel like an enormous stretch of time, wide enough to fit a whole new version of himself inside it. Then he would glance at the calendar later and realize the days were already slipping away, one after another, as if September were pulling them like a tide. 2 months became 7 weeks. 7 weeks became 6, and the whole while, Ron felt like he was waiting at the edge of something he couldn't see. Molly treated the waiting the way she treated most big feelings. She folded them into tasks. By the second day, after Ron received his letter, she had created 3 lists. By the third day, there were 5. Ron didn't even know what all of them were for. One was clearly supplies. One was clearly money. One seemed to be an early version of things Ron might forget if he's left to pack, which made Ron roll his eyes while secretly knowing she was right. She also began doing little things around the house as if she could make the moment less sharp by making everything else more stable. She fixed a loose stair. She resealed a window charm that had been letting in drafts. She scrubbed the already clean kitchen floor until it shone. She sorted the pantry, lining jars up by size and label. Ron watched her sometimes and understood, even without being told, that it wasn't really about the pantry. It was about control. If the world was about to change, Molly wanted to be able to point at least one corner of it and know she'd set it in order. Arthur's approach to waiting was quieter. He talked more. Not loud, not dramatic, just more. He would lean in the doorway while Ron helped Molly in the garden and tell him little stories about Hogwarts that he hadn't told before. Not the grand stories Bill and Charlie told, full of Quidditch glory or dragon-taming confidence. Arthur's stories were smaller, and in a way, those were the ones that made Hogwarts feel most real. He told Ron about getting lost in the castle his first week and pretending it was deliberate, as if wandering aimlessly was a choice. He told Ron about the first time he saw the library, rows and rows of books that seemed to go on forever, and how he'd stood there in awe, wondering how anyone could ever read even half of them. He told Ron about a suit of armor that always seemed to be in the wrong place, and how first years would swear it followed them just to make them feel watched. Ron listened, like someone collecting water in his hands, trying not to let any of it spill. Percy, unsurprisingly, became convinced that Ron's letter was a sign that it was time for a structured, academic campaign. At first, Ron avoided him instinctively. Percy's version of helpful often came with an invisible weight, like you were being measured and found wanting before you'd done anything. But Percy did something unexpected. He approached Ron one afternoon when Ron was sitting on the back steps, staring at the letter again in that way people stared at things when they were trying to convince themselves they were real. Percy sat beside him without preamble. He didn't lecture. He didn't immediately produce parchment. He just sat. For a full minute, neither of them spoke. Then Percy cleared his throat. Not the pompous, I am about to deliver knowledge throat clear, but the slightly awkward, I don't know how to start one. You're nervous, Percy said. Ron snorted.
No, I'm thrilled.
I love the idea of going to a castle where everything moves and professors judge you and the ghosts float through walls. Percy's mouth twitched. You are nervous. Ron stared straight ahead, eyes narrowed. You were nervous. Percy exhaled, and to Ron's surprise, he didn't deny it. Yes, Percy admitted quietly. I was. The admission hung in the air like a small miracle. Ron glanced at him, trying to read his brother's face. Percy looked younger, somehow, not in age, but in the way his expression had slipped out of its usual armor. I thought, Percy began, then stopped, as if choosing words carefully. I thought I had to prove something, because Bill was Bill, and Charlie was Charlie, and everyone expected. He cut himself off, jaw tightening. Ron didn't say anything. He just waited. Percy's shoulders rose and fell in a controlled breath. I was terrified, Percy said, voice low, of being the one who wasn't impressive, ordinary. The word hit Ron like it had been thrown. Ron swallowed. Yeah, he whispered, barely audible. Percy glanced at him sharply, as if surprised Ron had agreed. For a moment, the two of them sat there with something like understanding between them, something Ron had never had with Percy before. Then Percy's reflexes kicked back in, like he'd remembered he was Percy. So, Percy said briskly, the armor sliding back into place, if you want, I can help you prepare. Not in a suffocating way, he added, sounding like the phrase pained him, but in a useful way. Ron stared at him. Percy's ears went slightly pink. I can show you what first year is like. What professors expect. Which books matter most. How to survive being you. Ron offered, half teasing. Percy narrowed his eyes. How to succeed, he corrected. Ron hesitated. Then he nodded once. Okay, he said. Percy looked faintly relieved, which was unsettling. And that was how Ron's summer became divided, without anyone announcing it formally. Mornings were for chores and home things. Helping Molly, feeding chickens, pulling gnomes, pretending the garden didn't secretly enjoy the battle. Afternoons were for Percy's useful preparation, which Ron discovered was actually useful when Percy wasn't being unbearable about it. And evenings. Evenings were when Fred and George became dangerous. They did not announce they were preparing Ron. They did not ask permission. They simply began, as if Ron's impending Hogwarts journey had triggered something in their brains that translated to, our little brother is leaving. We must train him. We must also enjoy ourselves. It started subtly. Ron would find small objects in his room that definitely had not been there before. A quill that looked ordinary until he dipped it in ink, at which point it wrote the opposite of what he intended. A piece of parchment that sighed loudly whenever he tried to write on it, as if personally offended by his handwriting. A tiny box of sweets, labeled, "Do not eat." Ron, suspicious by nature, did not eat them. Later, he saw George toss one to a gnome, and the gnome's ears turned bright purple for an hour. Educational, Fred said when Ron confronted them. Practical, George agreed. You're just messing with me, Ron accused. We're teaching you to be cautious, Fred replied, entirely too pleased with himself. We're teaching you to question everything, George added. Especially anything we give you, Fred finished. Ron couldn't argue with that. He hated that he couldn't argue with that. One late afternoon, Ron found the twins in the orchard, with a broom propped against a tree and a small pile of objects on the grass. A hoop, a rope, and what looked alarmingly like a dented saucepan. Ron stopped walking. No! Fred looked up brightly. Yes. George grinned. It's time. Ron took a step backward. Time for what? Fred stood and dusted grass off his knees with exaggerated seriousness. Time for basic aerial awareness training. Ron stared. That's not a thing, George nodded solemnly. It is now. Ron glanced around. Where's Mum? Fred's grin widened. Busy. Ron narrowed his eyes. Where's Dad? George gestured vaguely. Ministry. Ron looked between them. You planned this. The twins exchanged a look that was basically a handshake. We would never, Fred said. We absolutely would, George corrected. Ron opened his mouth to argue, but George was already grabbing the broom and shoving it into Ron's hands. Ron's fingers tightened around the handle automatically. The broom was old, one of the family ones, with bristles that had seen better years. It had flown with 5 brothers before him, and would probably outlive him out of spite. Fred pointed at the hoop. Right, he said. Objective. Fly through the hoop. Ron blinked. That's easy? George lifted the rope, tied it to the hoop, and then, without Ron even seeing the movement clearly, flicked his wand so the hoop rose into the air, swaying gently like something alive. Fly through the hoop, George repeated. Now it moves. Ron stared at the floating hoop. You can't just... Fred clapped his hands once. Welcome to Hogwarts. Nothing stays still. Ron looked suspiciously at the saucepan. What's that for? George smiled too sweetly. That's for later. Ron didn't like the sound of that. Still, he mounted the broom. The moment his feet left the ground, a familiar sense of freedom washed through him, cutting through the anxiety that had been pressing on his chest all summer. Up here, above the grass, above the lists and the letter and the looming castle in his mind, he felt like himself again. He flew forward, aiming for the hoop. It drifted sideways. Ron corrected, tilted, tried again. The hoop bobbed upward at the last second. Ron missed, swearing under his breath as he shot past. Fred called, Again! Ron swung the broom around. Stop moving it! George called back. Can't! It's a simulation. Ron gritted his teeth and tried again. This time, he watched the hoop's pattern. It wasn't random. George was moving it, but he was moving it in a rhythm. Ron realized he could anticipate it if he paid attention. He hovered, breathed, then darted forward the moment the hoop dipped. He flew through cleanly. Fred and George whooped, loud enough to scare a flock of birds out of the nearest tree. Ron landed, flushed with success despite himself. That was actually... He started. Fred slapped him on the back. Brilliant! George nodded. See? You learn fast. Ron squinted. You're not allowed to sound proud. It's unsettling. Fred grinned. We can sound however we like. George picked up the saucepan. Ron's stomach dropped. No. Yes, George said cheerfully. Ron took a step back. What are you doing with that? Fred's eyes gleamed. Next lesson. Ron's voice rose. There are lessons now? George held the saucepan like a trophy. Defensive reflex training. Ron stared. You're going to throw that at me? Fred looked offended. We're not barbarians, George corrected. We're innovators. Ron's eyes widened. You are going to throw that at me? Fred nodded. Not hard. George nodded. Oh, moderately. Ron's hands tightened into fists. Mum will kill you. Fred's grin widened. That's why we're doing it now. Ron opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, George tossed the saucepan. Ron flinched instinctively, ducking. The saucepan sailed over his head and clanged harmlessly against a tree. Fred clapped. Good. Ron stared at them. That was insane. George looked pleased. You ducked. Ron's heart pounded. Because you threw a saucepan at my head. Fred shrugged. And you survived. Ron glared. What is the point of this? George lifted his wand, and the saucepan floated back into his hand. Point is, at Hogwarts, things come at your head. Ron opened his mouth and closed it, because, annoyingly, he could picture it. A crowded corridor, a moving staircase, someone dropping something from above. Wise sabotage, desolate. Peeves, if he was real, throwing chalk or water or anything else he could get his hands on. Ron scowled. You could just tell me that without throwing kitchenware. Fred nodded. Yes, George nodded, but then you wouldn't learn. Ron groaned. They spent another hour on absurd training that Ron would deny ever participating in if anyone asked. It was ridiculous. It was chaotic. It was Fred and George at their most Fred and George. And yet, Ron felt lighter afterward. Laughing, even while annoyed, loosened something in him. The waiting felt less heavy when it was full of moments like that. Moments that reminded him he wasn't stepping into the unknown alone. His brothers had already walked through it. They knew the rhythm of it. They were preparing him in their own strange way. When Ron went back inside, sweaty and grass-stained, Molly took one look at him and narrowed her eyes. What have you been doing? She demanded. Ron froze. Fred and George, behind him, put on their most innocent faces. Ron's mind raced. If he told the truth, he'd be dead. If he lied, Molly would know. She always knew. Ron chose a third option. Flying, he said. Just flying. Molly's gaze flicked over him, lingered on the faint dent in the saucepan that George was trying to hide behind his leg. Her eyes narrowed further. Boys, she said softly. Fred smiled. Yes, Mum? Molly lifted her wand slightly. George spoke quickly. Ron's fine, Fred added. Very safe. Molly's expression did not change. If I find my good pans in the orchard again, I will personally turn both of you into garden gnomes. Fred nodded solemnly. A fair consequence. George nodded. A reasonable punishment. Molly's eyes flicked to Ron, and her expression softened just a fraction. Go wash up, she said. And don't track mud through my kitchen. Ron nodded quickly. Yes, Mum. He escaped upstairs, heart racing in relief. That night, lying in bed, Ron stared at the ceiling and listened to the burrow creak and settle. The goo thumped faintly in the attic. The twins whispered in their room, plotting something as naturally as breathing. Percy's quill scratched rhythmically through the wall, a steady sound that meant he was writing again. Ron held his letter one more time, unfolded it carefully, then folded it back. He tried to picture the train, the castle, the sorting. He tried to picture himself walking into a dormitory full of strangers and claiming a bed as his own. He tried to picture himself raising a wand in class and producing sparks on purpose. The pictures were still blurry, but they were less impossible than they had been. And in the quiet of the burrow at night, with the familiar sounds of home around him, Ron let himself believe, just a little, that he might actually belong in that castle. The next afternoon came with the kind of gentle heat that made the burrow feel half asleep even when it was busy. The sunlight lay across the garden in warm patches, and the air smelled of crushed grass and ripe apples from the orchard. Ron helped Molly hang washing on a line that was trying its best to knot itself out of spite. When he was done, he stood for a moment with his hands on his hips, watching the house sway slightly in the breeze, like it was breathing. Two worlds, he thought. The burrow, crooked and familiar and loud with love. Hogwarts, towering and strange, and full of rules he didn't know yet. Between them, 2 months, less now. He wiped his hands on his trousers and headed towards the sitting room, because Percy had decided, after lunch, was the best time for tutoring, which proved Percy had never actually listened to anyone speak in his whole life. After lunch was when everyone wanted to lie down and let the world drift. Percy, apparently, wanted to lecture. Ron paused in the doorway. Percy had already arranged the room as if it were a classroom. The coffee table was cleared, except for a neat stack of books and parchment. An inkwell sat precisely at the top right corner, like a tiny soldier following orders. There were 2 quills, aligned so neatly that Ron could feel his own handwriting recoil in shame just looking at them. Percy sat upright on the sofa, legs crossed, holding a roll of parchment in both hands. His hair was combed, his collar was straight. He looked like he'd decided tutoring was an official event and therefore required a uniform. Ron stared. Percy stared back. "Sit," Percy said, as if Ron had wandered into a meeting. Ron dropped into the armchair opposite, slouching intentionally because he was not going to let Percy make him feel like a small child on purpose. He was already going to feel like that at Hogwarts. He wasn't doing it at home, too. Percy's eyes flicked to Ron's slouch. His mouth tightened. Ron slouched more. Percy took a slow breath through his nose, the way Molly did when she was trying not to hex someone. "All right," Percy said, voice clipped. "First, we're going to go through basic expectations." Ron lifted his eyebrows. "Like what?" Percy's eyes narrowed. "Like not interrupting." Ron shut his mouth. Percy nodded, satisfied, and unrolled the parchment. It dropped to the floor and kept dropping. Ron watched, horrified, as it unfurled down the length of the sofa, slid off the edge, pooled on the rug, and continued like a very determined snake. Ron blinked slowly. "Percy," he said. "Ha! That's not an overview. That's a life sentence." Percy looked offended. "It's condensed." Ron stared. What was the full version? Percy's ears went pink. 17 feet. Ron felt his soul leave his body. He leaned back in the chair, letting his head tip toward the ceiling. "I'm going to die," he muttered. Percy snapped the parchment back up with a sharp flick, rolling it quickly as if the length of it was somehow Ron's fault. "You're not going to die," Percy said stiffly. You're going to Hogwarts. Ron sighed. Same thing. Percy ignored him. Now, he said, tapping the top book with his finger, we begin with transfiguration. Ron blinked. Why transfiguration? Percy looked at him, like he'd asked why the sky was blue. Because Professor McGonagall teaches it, and she is strict. If you can survive her, you can survive anyone. Ron's stomach flipped. Strict how? Percy sat forward slightly, his tone shifting. Not into pompous lecture tone, into something real.
She expects effort, Percy said. She expects you to try.
And she expects you to respect the work. Ron swallowed. Okay. Percy slid the book toward him. Ron picked it up carefully, like it might bite. The cover was worn in the way hand-me-downs always were in the burrow, creased at the corners, slightly softened from years of use. It smelled like old paper and faintly like someone else's life. Percy watched him closely. Read the first page, Percy instructed. Ron sighed, but he opened the book anyway. The writing was dense and formal. Ron's eyes skimmed the first paragraph and tried to make sense of it. Transfiguration wasn't just turn a thing into another thing. It was theory, laws, principles. It was... Ron frowned. Why is this so wordy? Percy looked offended on behalf of the author. Because it's important. Ron kept reading. His lips moved slightly without his permission, a childhood habit, from learning to read by sounding things out. Percy waited. After a few minutes, Ron lowered the book and rubbed his eyes. So, he said slowly, you have to really picture it? Yes, Percy said, pleased. And you have to mean it, Ron added.
Exactly.
Ron frowned again. But how do you know if you're picturing it right? Percy leaned back, crossing his arms. You practice. Ron stared. That's it? The big academic strategy is... practice? Percy's mouth twitched. Yes. Ron blinked. Percy's expression softened just a fraction. Magic isn't like, Percy said carefully, searching for words that wouldn't sound like he was trying to be kind. It's not about being naturally brilliant. Not entirely. It's about repetition. Doing it wrong until you do it less wrong. Ron stared at him. That sounded almost comforting. Percy stiffened. It was factual. Ron snorted, but the knot in his chest loosened slightly. Percy began going through the basics of Hogwarts classes, one by one. He did it methodically, the way he did everything, structure and order, as if the world would behave if you just arranged it properly. Transfiguration, strict but fair. Charms, more practical, more responsive. Herbology, dirt under your nails, patience. Potions, precision and instruction. Defense against the dark arts. Unpredictable depending on the teacher, but still important. History of magic. Dull, but required. Astronomy. Cold nights and careful measurements. Ron listened, half fascinated and half overwhelmed. It wasn't the details that scared him most. It was the sheer volume of things he didn't know yet. Percy noticed his expression. Don't look like that, Percy said sharply. Ron blinked. Like what? Like you think you can't do it. Ron looked down at his hands. Maybe I can't. Percy's posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and for a moment he looked less like a prefect in training and more like Ron's brother, an older boy who had been scared once too. You can, Percy said, voice lower. You can, because you're not the only one who's gone in not knowing anything. No one knows anything first year. That's the point. Ron stared at him. Percy cleared his throat, as if embarrassed by his own sincerity. You will have to work, he added quickly. Obviously. But you can do it. Ron's throat felt tight. Was it hard? He asked quietly. For you? Percy's expression tightened again, but not with indignation. With honesty. Yes, Percy said. Ron waited. Percy's fingers tightened slightly around his quill. It was hard because everyone expected me to be like Bill. Ron felt his stomach drop. Percy glanced up, meeting Ron's eyes. They didn't say it, he said. Not out loud, but you feel it. You know. You walk into the castle and you know your brother has already walked these halls, already impressed teachers, already done everything properly. Ron's throat tightened even more, because that was exactly what he was scared of. Except he had 5 brothers ahead of him, not just one. Percy swallowed. And I kept thinking, what if I'm not impressive? What if I'm just me? Ron nodded, barely able to speak. Percy's voice softened. It got easier when I stopped trying to be Bill, he said, and started trying to be the best Percy I could be. Ron stared. That sounds reasonable, Percy sniffed. I am often reasonable. Ron let out a short laugh, and Percy's mouth twitched again, almost a smile. They continued. Percy explained how to take notes, which Ron thought was ridiculous because he'd taken notes in primary school. But Percy's method was extreme. Percy color-coded. Percy annotated. Percy created margins for follow-up questions and cross-reference. Percy probably had a system for the way he breathed. Ron listened anyway, because some part of him recognized something valuable underneath Percy's obsession. Percy didn't just love rules. Percy loved certainty. And Hogwarts was a place that offered it in small ways. If you do this, you get this. If you study, you improve. If you follow instructions, you succeed. Percy clung to that, and Ron could understand why. Halfway through the lesson, Fred and George drifted into the sitting room with the air of 2 cats who had just realized there was a warm patch of sun nearby. They leaned against the doorway, watching. Percy didn't look up. Go away. Fred's eyebrows lifted. Oh, Percy, don't be like that. George nodded solemnly. We're here to observe the educational process. Percy's quill scratched harder. You're here to ruin it. Fred smiled sweetly. We're here to ensure Ron doesn't die of boredom, George added.
Which is a real risk. Ron!
Trapped between his brothers, felt an odd rush of affection. Their teasing was familiar and safe. Percy's seriousness was new and unsettling. Percy finally looked up, his eyes sharp. If you interrupt again, I will tell Mum you've been using her good pans in the orchard. Fred froze. George froze. Ron stared. So Mum knows. Percy's mouth twitched in triumph. Fred cleared his throat. Right, he said briskly. We have errands. George nodded. Very urgent. They vanished. Ron stared at Percy. You blackmailed them. Ha 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 ha. Percy looked smug for exactly half a second before he corrected himself. I motivated them. Ron shook his head, half laughing. Percy continued the lesson, and to Ron's surprise, the hours passed faster than he expected. Percy wasn't actually unbearable when he was teaching. He was clear. He was detailed. And now, he could explain things in a way that made them feel manageable. He also cared. Ron could feel it. In the way Percy watched him for understanding. in the way Percy corrected him without mocking, in the way Percy's voice softened when Ron admitted fear. When the lesson ended, Ron's head was full of Hogwarts and theories and expectations. He felt like someone had poured an entire library into his brain and then asked him to carry it around. But he also felt something else, a small, unfamiliar confidence. Not the confidence that said, "I will be brilliant," just the confidence that said, "I can learn." Percy rolled his parchment back up with visible satisfaction. "We'll continue tomorrow," he announced. Ron groaned. "Tomorrow?" Percy frowned. "Yes. You want to be prepared." Ron hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he admitted. "I do." Percy's expression softened, barely, but enough that Ron noticed. "Good," Percy said. Ron stood stretching his arms above his head. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Actually," Percy blinked, surprised. Then his ears went pink again. "Well," he said stiffly, "it's what older brothers do." Ron smiled slightly. "Is it?" Percy looked away. "Yes." Ron left the sitting room and went upstairs, his mind buzzing. He lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about transfiguration theory and potions precision, and the idea of sitting in a classroom with a wand in his hand. He still felt scared, but now the fear had edges he could name, and somehow, naming it made it smaller. That evening, Ginny found him lying on his bed with a textbook open and a look of intense confusion on his face. "Percy's doing lessons," she said, climbing up beside him without asking. "Is it awful?" Ron sighed. "It's Percy." Ginny nodded, like that explained everything. Ron glanced at her. "He's actually helpful," he admitted reluctantly. Ginny's eyes widened. "That's horrifying." Ron snorted. "What?" "Yeah." Ginny picked up the open book, scanning the page. "What's that?" "Transfiguration theory," Ron said. Ginny frowned. "That looks boring." "It is," Ron admitted. "But I think it matters." Ginny looked at him for a long moment, then handed the book back. "You're going to be brilliant," she said, voice steady. Ron rolled his eyes. "You too." Ginny didn't smile this time. "No, I mean it. Because you're actually trying." Ron stared at her. Ginny shrugged, suddenly shy. "That's what's brilliant about you, Ron. You try." Ron felt his throat tighten again. He looked down at the book, at the dense words, at the unfamiliar future waiting inside them. "I'll write to you," he said quietly, changing the subject before his feelings got too big. Ginny nodded. "Every week." Ron smiled. "Every week." Ginny hopped off the bed. "Good," she said. "Now don't let Percy turn you into him." Ron snorted. "I'd rather be expelled." Ginny grinned. "Exactly." After she left, Ron lay back and listened to the house. Fred and George's laughter floated down the hall. Percy's quill scratched. Molly and Arthur's voices murmured softly through the walls. Home noises, normal noises, and yet, every day, the countdown in Ron's mind ticked down. Less time, less waiting, more real. He closed his eyes and tried to picture the Gryffindor common room, like Charlie had described, round and warm and full of firelight. He tried to picture himself sitting by that fire with a book open, writing a letter to Ginny, telling her everything. For the first time, the image didn't feel impossible. It felt, maybe, and maybe was enough for now. The next morning started the way most mornings at the Burrow started, with sounds that suggested someone, somewhere, had already decided peace was optional. Ron woke to a muffled thump from upstairs, probably the ghouls shifting in the attic, followed by a sharper, more deliberate sound from the garden, like something metal had been set down on grass with purpose. He lay still for a moment, eyes half open, listening. Another clink, a low murmur of voices. And then, unmistakably, Fred's voice, bright with the kind of excitement that usually meant trouble. Right then, Fred said somewhere below, if Ron's going to survive Hogwarts, he needs proper training. George's voice followed, equally cheerful and equally ominous. Proper being the key word. Can't send him in unprepared. That would be irresponsible. Ron closed his eyes again, as if refusing to wake could delay whatever they were about to do. Unfortunately, his brothers did not believe in mercy. He dragged himself out of bed, dressed with the grim resignation of someone walking toward a fate he couldn't avoid, and went to the window. The garden below had been transformed. Not completely. Fred and George rarely managed anything that neat, but enough that Ron could see an obvious effort to make something structured, which somehow made it worse. There were buckets arranged in a line like stepping stones. A couple of hoops floated lazily above the grass, bobbing as if they were pretending not to notice they'd been charmed. A broom lay propped against the apple tree, and, for reasons Ron did not want to understand, something that looked suspiciously like one of Molly's mixing bowls had been dragged into the scene and placed near a pile of oddly shaped objects. Ron stared down at it. His stomach sank. He turned from the window and glanced around his room, as if he might find a hiding place that Fred and George would respect. There wasn't one. They had grown up in the burrow. They could find anything. They had probably already planned for every possible escape route. Ron sighed and headed downstairs. The kitchen was empty, which was unusual. Molly was either already out in the village or busy somewhere else in the house. Arthur, if it was a weekday, was likely at the ministry. Percy's door, down the hall, was closed, which usually meant he was either writing, reading, or preparing to remind everyone of something. And Ginny Guinea was sensible. She slept when she could. That left Ron alone. Alone, that is, except for the two red-haired disasters waiting in the garden. Fred and George turned at the sound of the back door creaking open, their faces lit up with identical delight. "Ah," Fred said as if welcoming a guest to an event. "The student arrives." George nodded gravely. "Right on schedule. Very promising." Ron stopped on the step, arms folded tightly across his chest. "What are you doing?" "Preparing you," Fred said, like it was obvious. George added, "for the realities of Hogwarts life." Ron stared at the obstacle course again. "This looks like you're preparing me to break my neck." Fred waved a hand dismissively. "Nonsense. We've carefully considered safety." George nodded. "We're only using moderately hazardous materials." Ron's eyes narrowed. Moderately hazardous is still hazardous. Fred clapped his hands once. "Exactly. You're learning already." Ron sighed, stepping down into the grass. The morning air was cool, damp with dew, and it soaked the toes of his trainers immediately. He looked at the buckets, the hoops, the broom, the bowl. "And what," Ron said slowly, "is the goal of this thing?" George stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back like a professor. "Goal is simple. You must complete the course." Fred added, "while under simulated stress." Ron frowned. "Simulated stress?" Fred gestured grandly. "We will create distractions, confusion, obstacles, all of which will prepare you for Hogwarts, where everything is constantly trying to distract you, confuse you, or make you fall down a staircase." Ron stared. "That's not comforting." George smiled brightly. "Hogwarts isn't about comfort, Ron. It's about character development. Ron's mouth fell open. Did Percy write that for you? Fred looked offended. We write our own wisdom. George nodded. Freshly sourced. Ron glanced at the hoops. Why are those floating? George pointed. Because in Hogwarts things move. Ron looked suspiciously at the broom. Why is that there? Fred beamed. Because in Hogwarts you might need to escape. Ron's eyes slid to the mixing bowl. Why is that there? Fred and George exchanged a look. A quick flicker of silent communication that Ron had watched his whole life and still couldn't interpret properly. George smiled too sweetly. That's for later. Ron's stomach tightened. No. Fred patted Ron's shoulder. Yes. Ron tried to step back. George, gently but firmly, guided him forward, like a shepherd guiding a reluctant sheep. Lesson 1, Fred announced, producing a bucket from nowhere and placing it over Ron's head before Ron could react. Sudden darkness, the smell of old feed and metal. Ron yelped, hands flying up. Hey! George's voice came, calm and instructional through the bucket. You've been disoriented. Fred added, delighted. Classic Peeves maneuver. Ron froze. Peeves? George spoke like he was introducing a particularly important historical figure. Peeves, the poltergeist. Ron's voice rose. You're still on about Peeves? Fred's voice dropped dramatically. We are always on about Peeves. Ron reached for the bucket's rim, but his hand hit air as he stumbled forward and banged into something with a loud clang. See, George said, pleased. Panic leads to collisions. Ron ripped the bucket off his head and glared. I am not panicking. I am being assaulted by household items. Fred nodded thoughtfully. Valid point. George nodded. However, you did collide with something. Ron looked around. He'd walked into a hanging hoop that had drifted near him while he was blind. It swayed gently, as if mocking him. Fred placed the bucket back into Ron's hands. Again. Ron stared at it like it was a cursed object. George's smile became persuasive. Ron, Hogwarts corridors, crowds, portraits, moving staircases, things thrown at your head. You need to be able to stay calm. Ron opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because, annoyingly, he could imagine it. He could imagine being in a hallway full of students, not knowing where he was going, trying to act like he did. He could imagine dropping his books. He could imagine someone laughing. He could imagine panic rising like heat. He hated that Fred and George were sometimes right, but Ron sighed, lifted the bucket, and put it back over his head. Darkness again. This time, he stood still for a second. He breathed in. He listened. Grass under his feet. A faint breeze. The distant cluck of chickens. Fred and George's quiet shuffling. Good, George said. See? Calm. Now move forward slowly. Ron moved. One careful step. Another. He held his hands out, mapping the space in front of him with touch. When his fingers brushed something, one of the hoops, cool and smooth, he moved around it. When he felt the edge of a bucket, he adjusted his path. Excellent, Fred said, voice proud, despite himself. Ron's heart was beating hard, but it wasn't pure panic anymore. It was concentration. Then something whooshed past his ear. Ron flinched instinctively. George's voice came, too pleased. Now add projectiles. Ron's voice shut up. Projectiles? Fred spoke calmly, like this was the most sensible thing in the world. You must learn to dodge while disoriented. Ron stumbled forward in protest, and something tapped his shoulder lightly. Not painful, but enough to make him jerk. "See?" George said. "Now you're learning." Ron took another step, listening harder. Another whoosh. This time he ducked. Whatever it was sailed overhead. Ron's breath caught. Another whoosh, lower. He leaned sideways instinctively, and it missed. A strange, reluctant thrill rose in his chest. It was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was being trained to dodge things while wearing a bucket on his head. And yet, he was doing it. He pulled the bucket off and stared at his brothers, breathing hard. Fred looked delighted. George looked proud. They both looked, in a way, like they'd been waiting for him to surprise himself. "That," Ron said, trying to sound angry and failing, "was the stupidest thing I've ever done." George grinned. "And you succeeded." Fred nodded solemnly. "You may live." Ron rolled his eyes so hard it nearly hurt. "What even were you throwing?" George held up a small, soft object, an old rolled-up sock. Ron stared. "You threw Percy's sock at my head?" Fred coughed. "Temporarily borrowed." "And?" George added quickly, "for educational purposes." Ron snorted. They moved on to other lessons, each one somehow more ridiculous than the last. There was a section where Ron had to walk the obstacle course, while Fred and George shouted directions from opposite sides. "Left, right, no, the other left. You're going to hit the hoop. That hoop's moving. This is why people die." Ron stopped in the middle and shouted, "You're both liars." Fred called back, pleased. "Exactly. Now you're learning to distrust information." George nodded enthusiastically. "Critical thinking, Ron. Essential." There was a section where Ron had to balance a stack of textbooks on his head while walking. "Posture," Fred declared. "Confidence." George added, "Confidence affects magic." Ron muttered, "I hate this," as he shuffled forward with his neck stiff and his arms out like a tightrope walker. Fred and George, naturally, made it worse by occasionally flicking the books lightly with their wands so the stack wobbled. Ron managed not to drop them, which filled him with a small, ridiculous pride. There was also a segment involving dung bombs. Ron drew the line there. "No," he said firmly. Fred looked shocked. "But dung bombs are practical." George nodded. "Strategic." Ron crossed his arms. "They smell," Fred shrugged. "So does the Hogwarts lake." Ron blinked. "What?" George nodded solemnly. "Trust us." Some parts of Hogwarts smell like old pond and damp stone. Ron looked briefly horrified. Then he remembered the sweet smell of the Burrow's kitchen, Molly's stew, freshly baked bread, the warmth of the fire. Homesickness struck him suddenly, sharp and unexpected, even though he hadn't left yet. He shoved it down quickly. Fred and George, oblivious or pretending to be, moved on. "Lesson 5, Fred announced eventually, standing in front of Ron like a professor. George joined him, mirroring the stance. Ron wiped sweat off his forehead. "How many lessons are there?" Fred's eyes gleamed. "As many as necessary." George nodded. "Until you're fully prepared." Ron groaned. Fred adopted a pompous voice. "Explain the 12 uses of dragon's blood." Ron blinked. "I don't know." George clapped once, delighted. "Wrong answer." Ron frowned. "How can it be wrong?" "How? How? How?" Fred leaned forward, lowering his voice like a mentor. "You never say, 'I don't know.'" without adding something that makes it sound like you're still competent. George nodded. You say, "Not yet, sir, but I'll research it and report back." Ron stared. That's just pretending. Fred's grin widened.
Yes.
George's grin matched it. It's survival. Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again, because he could imagine it. A professor calling on him in a room full of students. His face burning. Everyone watching, his mind blank, the humiliation of saying, "I don't know," and sounding like the only idiot in the castle. Ron swallowed. "Try again," Fred said. Ron took a breath. "Not yet," he said slowly. "But I'll research it and report back." Fred applauded. George applauded. Ron glared. "Don't clap. It makes it worse." Fred's eyes sparkled. "We're proud." George nodded. "You're learning." The back door slammed open. All three of them jumped. Percy stood there, still in his dressing gown, hair slightly messy, looking like he'd been dragged out of bed by chaos itself. He stared at the garden scene. The buckets, the floating hoops, the pile of objects. Ron, sweaty and grass-stained. Fred and George, far too pleased. Percy's eyes narrowed slowly. "What?" Percy said, voice dangerously calm. "Are you doing?" Fred smiled innocently. "Teaching Ron." George nodded. "Educational exercises." Percy's gaze flicked to the mixing bowl. His jaw tightened. "And," Percy said, "why is Mum's good mixing bowl outside?" Fred blinked. It wanted fresh air. George nodded solemnly. "It's important for bowls to experience the world." Percy's voice rose slightly. "Put it back." Fred sighed dramatically. "Percy, don't be like that." George added, "We're trying to help." Percy stepped down into the grass like a prefect stepping into a crime scene. He surveyed everything with an expression of pure outrage. "That," Percy said, pointing at the hoops, "is Dad's car battery." Fred's smile slipped. "Is it?" Percy's eyes snapped to the pile. "And those are my socks." George's expression became almost offended. "Borrowed?" Percy's face flushed red. "That's not borrowing. That's theft." Fred put a hand over his heart. "Percy." The dramatic language. Percy's eyes moved to Ron. "Ron," he said, voice sharp, "you don't need this nonsense." Ron hesitated, because Ron could see both sides. Percy's lessons were useful in a straightforward way. Fred and George's training was insane, but it made Ron laugh, and it made the fear loosen its grip. He didn't want to choose. He didn't want this to become another battle in the burrow, where he was the object being fought over. So Ron did something he hadn't expected himself to do. He stood up straighter and spoke carefully. "Maybe," Ron said. "Both things help." Three heads snapped toward him. Fred looked delighted. George looked delighted. Percy looked like he'd bitten into something sour. Ron held up his hands quickly, trying to keep control of the moment. "I mean, Percy's right. I need to know the actual work. But the castle is still going to be weird, isn't it? It's still going to have moving stairs and all that. I should probably know how to deal with the other stuff too." Fred and George nodded, so enthusiastically Ron thought their heads might fall off. Percy's eyes narrowed. "The other stuff is going to get you detention." Fred shrugged. "Detention builds character." George nodded. "Also excellent for learning the layout of the castle. Filch takes you everywhere." Percy spluttered. "Phew, can't." Ron cut in quickly, still trying to steer the conversation away from disaster. "Percy, I'll do your lessons too. I promise. But let them, he glanced at the twins, do whatever this is. Percy's mouth tightened. He stared at Ron for a long moment, as if weighing something. Then, very stiffly, Percy said, "Fine." Fred gasped dramatically. Percy conceded. George clutched his chest. "Mark the day." Percy shot them a look sharp enough to cut glass. "But," he added, voice clipped, "put everything back before Mum gets home. And if Ron gets in trouble because of you, I will remind him for the rest of his life that I warned him." Fred smiled sweetly. "Duly noted." George nodded. "We love a formal warning." Percy turned on his heel and marched back inside. Dressing gown billowing like he was wearing robes, dignity intact through sheer stubbornness. Ron exhaled slowly. Fred and George watched Percy disappear, then turned back to Ron with identical proud expressions. "Well played," Fred said. George nodded, diplomatic. Ron rolled his eyes. "I just didn't want you lot yelling." Fred clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll do well at Hogwarts?" George smiled. "You might even survive us." Ron snorted. They spent the next hour cleaning up the garden at a speed that suggested Fred and George could be responsible if threatened with Molly's wrath. The mixing bowl went back into the kitchen, spotless. The car battery returned to the shed. Percy's socks were returned to his drawer, slightly singed. Ron did not ask. By the time Molly came back from the village later, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing the look of someone ready to scold if necessary, the garden looked normal. Ron sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read. Fred and George pretended to be helpful by peeling potatoes. Molly's eyes narrowed, the way they always did when she could sense deception. "What have you been doing?" she asked. Ron's heart thumped. Fred smiled innocently. "Nothing." George nodded. "Absolutely nothing." Molly stared at them for a long moment. Then she sighed, as if deciding she didn't have the energy for whatever truth was hiding behind their faces. "Fine," she said briskly. "If nothing ends with a hole in my garden again, you're all sleeping outside." Fred grinned. "Camping," George nodded. "Adventure." Molly pointed her wand at them. "Peel properly." They peeled properly. Ron sat there, listening to the familiar rhythm of the burrow, Molly's brisk instructions, the twins' murmured jokes, the clink of cutlery, the soft rustle of grocery bags. It was ordinary, and yet Ron's mind kept sliding forward, imagining the Hogwarts kitchens, the Great Hall, the common room fire, new voices. That night, Percy did appear with actual books and actual notes, as promised. Ron sat through it, determined to keep his word. But the absurd morning with the twins stayed with him too, not as fear, though it had started that way, but as something lighter, as if Hogwarts wasn't only terrifying, as if it could also be ridiculous, as if he could laugh there. And maybe that mattered just as much as knowing how to write an essay properly. Because somewhere, underneath all the preparation, Percy's notes, Molly's lists, Fred and George's chaos, there was the same message, spoken in different languages. You are not alone. And Ron, sitting at the kitchen table, with ink on his fingers and the smell of dinner in the air, let that settle into him quietly, like warmth. The days after Fred and George's garden training took on a strange shape, as if time itself couldn't decide whether it wanted to hurry Ron towards Hogwarts or keep him safely held at home. In the mornings, the burrow was still the burrow. Warm bread smells, Molly's voice calling up the stairs, the clatter of dishes, the radio crackling with faint, wizarding music when Arthur managed to coax it into behaving. In the afternoons, the house became a shifting classroom, a workshop, a rehearsal space for a future Ron couldn't fully picture, but couldn't stop imagining. And at night, when the lights dimmed and the last argument was finished and the last cup of tea was washed, Ron found himself lying awake more often than not, staring at the slanted ceiling above his bed and feeling the weight of a place he hadn't even reached yet. 10 days. 9. 8. Every time he counted, it felt both too close and too far away. Molly dealt with the countdown the way Molly dealt with everything. By doing. She scrubbed the kitchen until it looked like it had never known a family of 7. She reorganized cupboards that had been organized already. She checked Ron's trunk, then checked it again, then checked it a third time, while insisting it had only been twice. She mended the same jumper seam Ron was fairly sure she'd already fixed, then mended it once more because the charm might not have set properly the first time. Arthur dealt with the countdown by becoming more openly present. He took longer at breakfast, lingering over his tea, asking Ron small questions that weren't really about anything and yet felt important because Arthur made them important. "How are you feeling about the train?" he asked one morning, as if the Hogwarts Express were a particularly complicated bit of Muggle machinery. Ron shrugged, shoving toast into his mouth to avoid answering too honestly. Arthur watched him with a kind expression. Excited. Ron chewed, swallowed. Yeah, Arthur nodded, nervous. Ron looked down at his plate. Bat, Arthur hummed thoughtfully. That's usually a sign you care. Ron glanced up. Is it? Arthur smiled. It's a sign you're paying attention. Percy dealt with the countdown by increasing his tutoring sessions, as if he could build Ron a bridge of knowledge sturdy enough to walk into Hogwarts without fear. He arrived with books. He arrived with parchment. He arrived with carefully written practice questions. He arrived with a tone that suggested he was doing Ron a favor by saving him from ignorance. Which was true, but Percy's delivery made it sound like he was saving him from drowning in a puddle. And yet, despite the pomposity, Ron couldn't deny Percy had changed slightly. Not dramatically. Percy was still Percy. He still corrected Ron's pronunciation when Ron read aloud. He still looked personally offended when Ron's handwriting leaned too far right. He still used the word methodology in sentences that did not need it. But there were moments now, brief ones, when Percy's voice softened and his eyes lost their sharpness. Moments when Percy was less concerned with being right and more concerned with Ron being okay. Ron didn't know what to do with those moments, so he usually pretended they hadn't happened. Fred and George, meanwhile, behaved as if the countdown was a personal challenge. They were everywhere. They appeared in doorways, with helpful suggestions. They handed Ron items for emergencies that Ron had to secretly throw away before Molly discovered them. They performed practice ambushes in the hallway, leaping out from behind furniture, like they were training him for a life of constant surprise. On the 4th day after the garden training, Ron opened his bedroom door and nearly walked straight into a string tied across the hallway at ankle height. He stopped just in time, heart pounding. Fred and George sat at the end of the corridor, watching. George nodded approvingly. Good reaction time. Fred sighed dramatically. Not bad. Though you did almost trip. Ron glared. That was you, Fred shrugged. Hogwarts will have worse. Ron muttered, You're the worst. George grinned.
Exactly.
Ginny dealt with the countdown in the quietest way of all. She didn't make lists. She didn't tutor. She didn't build obstacle courses. She didn't scold or fuss or offer advice unless Ron asked. Instead, she watched. Ron noticed it most at meals. Ginny would sit across from him, chin resting lightly on her hand, eyes following him, as if she was trying to memorize him before he left. When Ron caught her looking, she quickly glanced down at her plate, pretending she'd been studying the pattern in the wood or counting peas. Ron started to feel a strange ache in his chest whenever he saw it. Because Ginny was excited, he knew she was. She asked questions, sometimes rapid fire, sometimes quiet and cautious.
What does the train look like inside?
She asked one afternoon while Ron was sorting quills. Like seats, Ron said, because he had never been on it. Ginny narrowed her eyes. That's not helpful. Ron laughed. Bill said it's old and it smells like sweets. Ginny nodded, satisfied. Good. Write that down. Write what down? Everything, Ginny said, fierce, so you don't forget. Ron blinked. You want me to write notes about what the train smells like? Ginny's eyes flashed. Yes, I want details. Ron shook his head, smiling despite himself. You're strange. Ginny lifted her chin. I'm prepared. And then there were moments, quieter ones, when Ginny didn't ask about Hogwarts at all. She'd just appear in Ron's room and sit on his bed while he packed and repacked small things. She'd hand him a quill and watch him test it. She'd sit cross-legged on the floor and sort sweets into piles for the train, with the seriousness of someone distributing rations for a long journey. Ron didn't always know what to say, but her presence felt steady, like a quiet promise that when he left, something would still be waiting for him here. On the evening of the 6th day before term, Ron found himself alone in the garden with his wand. The willow wand. His wand. He'd been carrying it more often now, tucked into his pocket the way Arthur had taught him, and sometimes he'd pull it out just to feel the weight of it in his hand, to remind himself it was real. That he had been chosen. That something in him had been enough for the wand to say yes. He stood near the edge of the vegetable patch, where the grass was flattened from years of gnome wrestling and family foot traffic. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in soft gold. The air was warm but not heavy, the kind of late summer evening that felt like the world was holding its breath. Ron raised his wand and stared at it. I should practice, he muttered. He hadn't done much actual spell work beyond small, accidental bursts when he was younger. Molly and Arthur had always been careful about that, not because they didn't trust him, but because Hogwarts had rules, and Ron wasn't quite sure what those rules were, only that the adults insisted they mattered. But now he was going to Hogwarts in days, and he was terrified of being the only one who didn't know how to do anything properly. He remembered Percy's lectures about technique. He remembered Fred and George's dramatic warnings about professors putting you on the spot. He remembered Arthur's calm voice. Practice doing it wrong until you do it less wrong. Ron took a breath and pointed his wand toward a small stone near the fence. He tried to remember the simplest charm he'd heard about. Something like light. He'd heard the word before. Bill had said it once in a story. Lumos. Ron's grip tightened. Lumos, he said quietly. Nothing happened. Ron blinked. He tried again, a little louder. Lumos. Nothing. He frowned, frustration rising. He tried again, waving his wand more sharply, because surely that was the problem. Still nothing. Ron let out a long breath. Brilliant, he muttered. Off to Hogwarts and I can't even do a bloody light spell. You're holding it like you're trying to strangle it. Ron jumped so hard his wand nearly flew out of his hand. He whipped around to find Charlie leaning against the fence post behind him, arms folded, face amused. Ron's heart hammered. Charlie, Charlie grinned. Sorry, didn't mean to sneak. Habit. Dragons prefer it when you don't stomp up to them. Ron swallowed, still startled. When did you get here? Charlie shrugged. A bit ago. Mum thought you'd want a quiet evening, she said. You've been looking like your brain's spinning. Ron glanced down at his wand, embarrassed. I was practicing. Charlie nodded, stepping closer. His eyes went to the wand, and his expression softened. Good, he said simply. Ron frowned. It's not working. Charlie held out his hand. Let me see. Ron hesitated, then handed it over. Charlie turned the wand over thoughtfully, fingers light on the wood. Nice, he murmured. Feels like it suits you. Ron felt oddly pleased and oddly vulnerable at the same time. Charlie handed it back. All right, he said, stepping around so he stood beside Ron. Show me how you're doing it. Ron lifted the wand again, pointed at the stone and said, Lumos. Nothing. Charlie tilted his head. You're saying it like you're asking it to work. Ron glanced at him. What's wrong with that? Charlie smiled. Magic's not polite, he said. You don't request it. You decide. Ron frowned. Decide? Charlie nodded. You have to mean it. Not just say it. Prayer, car, car, car. You don't go, please, could a light happen? You go, light now. Ron stared. That sounds aggressive. Charlie shrugged. Magic likes confidence. Ron thought of Percy's lectures about posture, Fred and George's nonsense about confidence being half of magic, Arthur's calm voice telling him to practice. Ron took a breath and tried to shift something in his chest from hope to certainty. He raised the wand, pointed, and said more firmly, Musters, just as old and as sentinel, as features, as features, as features. Still nothing. Ron's face flushed hot. I'm rubbish, Charlie snorted. You're 11, he said. You're not rubbish. You're new. Ron's throat tightened. But everyone else will be better. Charlie shook his head. Everyone else will be faking it, he said, just like Bill told you. Some of them will have practiced more. Sure, some of them will have parents who taught them things early. But you're not walking into Hogwarts as the only clueless kid. Hogwarts is full of clueless kids. Ron didn't look convinced. Charlie pointed at Ron's hand.
Loosen your grip.
Ron blinked. What? You're holding it too tight, Charlie said. You're tense. It's like trying to write with a cramped hand. The wand's an extension, not a weapon you're wrestling. Ron loosened his fingers slightly. Charlie nodded. Better. Now, wrist, not arm. Small movement. Like you're flicking water off your fingertips. Ron tried to mimic it. Charlie watched carefully. And the word, he added. Don't overthink it. Don't make it big. Just clear. Ron swallowed, focused. He raised his wand. He pictured the light, simple and steady. He flicked his wrist. Lumos, he said. A small glow sparked at the wand tip. Weak, flickering, but real. Ron's breath caught. I did it. Charlie grinned. You did. Ron stared at the light like it was a miracle, like it proved something bigger than a simple spell. It wasn't just a light. It was proof he could do it. Proof he wasn't locked out of magic. Pre-Hogwarts wasn't going to swallow him whole. Ron's eyes stung unexpectedly. He blinked hard and pretended it was the wind. Charlie thankfully didn't comment. He just nodded and said, "Again." Ron extinguished it with a shaky knocks, which did nothing. So Charlie taught him that too. And then they practiced. Light on, light off, light on again. Each time the glow grew steadier. Not brilliant, not dazzling, but consistent. After a while, Ron's shoulders started to relax. He stopped holding his breath between attempts. His movements became less jerky, more natural. Charlie watched him, satisfaction in his face like he was watching someone find their footing. "You know," Charlie said casually, "first year isn't about being impressive." Ron's wand light flickered slightly. "Isn't it?" Charlie snorted. "No," he said. "First year is about surviving." Ron shot him a look. Fred and George said that. Charlie's grin widened.
Well, they're not wrong,
He admitted.
but I don't mean surviving like you're in danger every day.
I mean, surviving the feeling of being small. Surviving the embarrassment when you don't know something. Surviving the homesick days when everything feels too big. Ron swallowed. "Did you get homesick?" Charlie glanced at him. "Of course," he said, as if it was obvious. "Everyone does, at least a bit. Even Fred and George." Ron blinked. "No, they didn't," Charlie laughed. "They did," he said. "They just hid it by being loud." Ron thought about that for a moment. Fred and George, so fearless on the outside, hiding softer feelings behind jokes. It made something shift in him. Bill was homesick too, Charlie added. He wrote Mum letters like he was writing official reports, trying to sound grown up. Percy, Charlie's expression softened. Percy was homesick in a different way. He was homesick for certainty, for knowing he was doing things right, so he clung to rules. Ron's chest tightened. "And you?" Charlie smiled, eyes distant. "I got homesick for the burrow's noise," he said. "For Ginny running around. For Mum yelling at someone. For Dad telling jokes no one laughed at." Ron snorted. "Dad's jokes aren't that bad." Charlie raised his eyebrows. "They are," he said firmly, then grinned. "But they're ours. You miss ours." Ron looked down at his wand. "What if I don't fit there?" Charlie's smile faded into something serious. "Ron," he said gently, "Hogwarts is made of kids who don't fit somewhere else. That's the point. You'll find people like you." Ron swallowed. "What if I don't?" Charlie shrugged. "Then you'll become someone who does," he said. "And that might take a few weeks. Or few months. But it happens." Ron stared at him. Charlie nudged Ron's shoulder lightly. "Keep going," he said. "Lumos knocks." Again. Ron practiced until the sun dipped fully below the horizon, and the garden turned purple with twilight. The wand light glowed warmly against the deepening darkness, illuminating Ron's hands, the grass at his feet, the fence line where Charlie leaned. When Ron finally lowered his wand, his hand ached a little, his fingers warm. He felt tired in a good way, like he'd done something real. Charlie nodded toward the burrow. "Come on," he said. "Mum will have tea ready, and if we miss it, she'll blame you." Ron smiled faintly. "Why me?" Charlie shrugged. "You're the youngest." "It's tradition." They walked toward the house together, the burrow's windows glowing warmly. Inside, voices and laughter drifted out like a promise. As they reached the back step, Charlie paused. "One more thing," he said. Ron looked up. Charlie reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in cloth. He placed it in Ron's hand. Ron unwrapped it carefully and found a little leather pouch, worn but sturdy, with a simple drawstring. "What's this?" Ron asked. Charlie shrugged, suddenly awkward. "It's for your pocket," he said. "For your spare coins, or your sweets, or whatever." Ron blinked. "It's nice." Charlie scratched the back of his neck. "I used it first year," he admitted. "Then Bill did. Then Percy." The twins refused because they said it wasn't dramatic enough. "But it's useful." Ron's throat tightened again, because of course it did. He tied the drawstring gently. "Thanks," he said quietly. Charlie nodded, as if refusing to let the moment get too sentimental. "Don't lose it," he said briskly. "It's been lost before, and Mum nearly had a meltdown when Bill wrote saying he'd misplaced it." Ron smiled. "I won't." Charlie opened the door and ushered him inside. The kitchen smelled like biscuits and tea, and the faint sharpness of Molly's cleaning charms. Arthur sat at the table, glasses slightly crooked, reading the paper and pretending he wasn't watching Ron closely. Percy sat with a book open, quill poised, looking like he was waiting to correct something. Fred and George leaned against the counter, whispering together and grinning at nothing. Ginny sat at the end of the table with a notebook open, scribbling something. When Ron walked in, Ginny's head snapped up. Her eyes immediately went to his wand, then to Charlie, then back to Ron. "What were you doing?" she demanded, voice sharp with curiosity. Ron hesitated then, because he wasn't sure why he did it, but because it felt right. He smiled slightly and said, "Practicing." Ginny's face lit up. "Did it work?" she asked, practically bouncing. Ron nodded, holding up his wand. "Lumos," he said quietly. A steady glow bloomed at the tip. Ginny gasped. "You did it!" Fred and George, watching, exchanged a look. Then Fred made a gagging noise. "Oh, look," he said dramatically. "Ron's being competent." George nodded solemnly. "It's unnatural." Ron rolled his eyes, but his grin wouldn't leave his face. "Shut up," he said, without heat. Arthur's eyes crinkled with pride. Molly bustled in from the pantry with a plate of biscuits, and when she saw the wand light, her hands froze for half a second. Then she smiled. Not big and loud. Not like when she was fussing. Just so well done, love, she said quietly, setting the biscuits down. "That's a good start." Ron's chest warmed. Percy sniffed. "It's a basic charm," he said, but there was something almost pleased in his eyes. "Still, better to practice now than embarrass yourself later." Fred leaned in. "Percy's complimenting you. Write it down. Record it for history." George nodded. It may never happen again. Percy glared at them, but Ron could see his mouth twitch slightly. Ginny leaned toward Ron, voice low. "Write to me about that," she said fiercely. "The first time it worked. That matters." Ron blinked. "Why?" Ginny's eyes flashed. "Because it's part of your story," she said, "and I want to know all of it." Ron swallowed, throat tight. "Okay," he said softly. "I will." Tea drifted on. Biscuits disappeared. The burrow settled into its evening rhythm. Later, when Ron went upstairs, he sat on his bed with his wand in his hand and the little pouch Charlie had given him tucked safely in his drawer. He thought about the light spell, about the way it had felt when it finally worked, like a door opening. He thought about Charlie's words. First year isn't about being impressive. It's about surviving the feeling of being small. Ron looked around his room, his trunk, his books, his patched clothes, his new jumper folded neatly. Everything looked the same. But inside him, something had shifted again. Not into certainty. Not into confidence like Bill's or Charlie's or even Percy's stiff determination, but into something steadier, a quiet understanding that he could do things he hadn't done before, that Hogwarts wasn't only a place where he might fail. It was a place where he might learn. He tucked his wand carefully under his pillow, like he'd begun to do, and lay down. From the hallway, he could hear Fred and George's laughter. From somewhere below, Molly's voice. From the window, the evening sky. From in tear, Ron closed his eyes. Less than a week now. Still terrifying. Still thrilling. And now, just barely, it felt possible. The week before Hogwarts didn't feel like a normal week. It looked like one if you glanced quickly. Laundry on the line, breakfast at the table, the garden needing weeding, Molly's chores, Arthur's paper, Fred and George moving through the house like restless wind. But under everything there was a quiet pressure. Like the burrow itself could sense what was coming. Ron felt it in the way his mother kept pausing mid-task, as if she'd forgotten what she was doing, and then remembered she was trying not to think. He felt it in the way Arthur asked more questions than usual. Not interrogating, not fussing, just checking in, like he was trying to store Ron's voice in his memory. He felt it in the way Percy kept appearing with one more helpful suggestion, as if he could build Ron a perfect path and keep him safe on it. And he felt it most sharply in Ginny, because Ginny was trying so hard to be brave that her bravery itself felt like a fragile thing. Every day, Ron's trunk sat near the foot of his bed like a silent reminder. Packed. Protected. Ready. And still, Ron didn't feel ready. Not really. Because a trunk could hold clothes and books and quills and sweets, but it couldn't hold the exact smell of the kitchen in the mornings. It couldn't hold Fred and George's laughter echoing down the corridor. It couldn't hold the weight of Ginny leaning against him on the steps, or Molly's hand pressing briefly to his shoulder when she walked past, as if she needed to touch him to reassure herself he was still there. So Ron filled the last week the only way he knew how. He did what he could. He helped Molly in the garden. He let Percy teach him until his eyes crossed. He let the twins train him in ways that were ridiculous, but annoyingly sometimes useful. And when he could, he went outside with his wand and practiced small spells that made him feel like Hogwarts wasn't just a story he'd heard from his brothers. It was a place he was actually going. One evening, Percy cornered him in the sitting room with a look of grim purpose and a roll of parchment that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment for days. Right, Percy said, setting the parchment down on the table like a declaration. We need to discuss time management. Ron, who had been peacefully trying to read the first chapter of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1, sighed so deeply it nearly turned into a groan. Percy, Ron said. Careful, it's still summer. Percy looked personally offended by the concept. Exactly, he said, the perfect time to establish productive habits before the term begins. Fred, lounging upside down in an armchair nearby, lifted his head. He's going to make you schedule your breathing. George, sitting on the floor pretending to mend something that was almost certainly not meant to be mended, nodded. Inhalation at precisely 6:02. Exhalation at 6:03. Percy ignored them with the determination of someone who had been ignoring them his entire life. He unrolled the parchment. It didn't just unfurl, it spilled. It rolled across the table, over the edge, and down toward the floor like it was trying to escape. Ron stared at it. Percy, Ron said weakly, that's not a schedule. That's a threat. Percy looked pleased. It's comprehensive. Fred sat up properly now, grinning. How long is it? Percy drew himself up. It covers waking hours. George blinked. All of them? Percy nodded firmly. Yes. Ron looked at the parchment again. It was divided into neat columns. Morning routine, class blocks, study time, revision time, meal breaks, extra reading, clubs, exercise, and something Percy had labeled * reflective assessment. Ron's stomach sank. What's reflective assessment? Ron asked, suspicious. Percy's eyes gleamed with academic delight. At the end of each day you evaluate your performance, he said. What you did well, what needs improvement, how you can refine your approach. Fred made a dramatic gagging sound. George added, he's trying to turn Hogwarts into a job. Percy's jaw tightened. Success requires discipline, he snapped. Ron glanced down the schedule again. Despite himself, he noticed something that made his chest tighten slightly. Percy had written in small, careful handwriting, squeezed into one corner of the parchment, Ask Salmon. Write home, minimum once a week. And beneath it, Ask Sam. If you feel lost, ask for help. Don't pretend you're fine. Ron looked up at Percy, caught off guard. Percy's face had gone a shade pinker, like he regretted that Ron had seen it. Ron didn't mention it. He just nodded slowly and said, All right, I'll look at it. Fred leaned toward George and whispered loudly, He's going to set it on fire. George nodded. Or feed it to the chickens. Ron shot them a look. I'm not. Fred looked wounded. You wouldn't burn Percy's masterpiece? You wouldn't burn Percy's masterpiece? Ron raised an eyebrow. I might fold it. Aggressively. Percy made a sound of outrage. Oh. But something about the moment. Percy caring too much, the twins mocking him, the familiar bickering, made Ron feel strangely calm. Because this was the burrow. This was how love looked here. Messy, loud, overbearing, ridiculous. It didn't always feel gentle, but it was real. That night, after Percy finally rolled his schedule back up, with all the reverence of someone handling sacred text, Ron went upstairs and found Ginny sitting on his bed. She was holding his trunk key in her palm, turning it over and over slowly as if she was trying to understand what it meant. Ron paused in the doorway. That's mine. Ginny looked up quickly. I know. Ron stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bed. Ginny held the key out to him. It feels strange, she said, voice quiet. Ron took it. It's just a key. Ginny shook her head. It's not just a key, she said. It's the key to your Hogwarts stuff. Ron snorted softly. That's one way to put it. Ginny's eyes flicked to his trunk. It's really happening, she whispered. Ron didn't know what to say. So he said, The only honest thing. Yeah. Ginny swallowed. I'm going to miss you, she said, quickly, like saying it faster would make it less dangerous. Ron's throat tightened. He tried to joke, because joking was safer. You'll be glad, Ron said. No more me stealing your toast. Ginny glared at him, watery-eyed. You steal everything. Ron smiled weakly. I'm a Weasley. Ginny's expression crumpled for a second. Then she shoved it back into place. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. Folded parchment, creased from being opened and closed. too many times. She shoved it at him. Ron took it carefully. What's this? Ginny lifted her chin. It's a list, she said. Ron blinked. A list of what? Ginny crossed her arms as if daring him to laugh. A list of things you have to write me about, she said. So you don't forget. Ron unfolded it. The handwriting was messy and eager, words squeezed into every available space. It said things like, what the train smells like, what the Great Hall looks like the first time, if the ghosts are scary or friendly, what the beds are like, if the portraits talk back, what you eat on the first night, your head, your first friend, your first enemy, your first detention, because you will probably get one. Ron stared at the list, warmth spreading through his chest. Gin, Ron said softly. This is a lot? Ginny's eyes flashed. That's the point. Ron looked at her. You wrote first enemy. Ginny shrugged. Everyone has someone who's mean, she said. And I want to know who it is so I can hate them properly. Ron laughed, the sound shaky. Ginny watched him carefully. You'll do it? She asked. You'll write it all? Ron nodded, holding the list carefully like it mattered, which it did. I'll write you everything, he promised. Ginny exhaled, shoulders loosening slightly. Good, she said, voice fierce, because if you don't, I'll be furious at Christmas. Ron smiled. Terrifying. Ginny nodded. Exactly. When she left, Ron lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling again, but the ache felt different now. Not gone, but steadier, like he had something to hold on to. The next day, Molly insisted on doing a final practice pack. Ron tried to protest. His trunk was already packed, but Molly looked at him with the expression of a woman who had raised 7 children and did not consider protests an obstacle. So she unpacked half of it, then repacked it, then performed a list of protective charms Ron didn't know the names of, muttering under her breath the way she did when she was concentrating. Arthur wandered in halfway through and watched with quiet amusement. You know, Arthur said gently, Hogwarts has cupboards. Molly sniffed. Cupboards don't replace mothers. Arthur's mouth twitched. No, dear. Ron sat on his bed and watched them, feeling both embarrassed and loved. When Molly finally stepped back, satisfied, Ron noticed something. His maroon jumper, his new one, the one with the big gold R, had been placed right near the top. Molly caught him looking. Easy to reach, she said quickly. If it's cold. Ron nodded, throat tight. Thanks, Mum. Molly's eyes shimmered. She turned away too fast, pretending to fuss with the trunk latch. That evening, Fred and George appeared in Ron's room when he wasn't there. Ron only realized later, because when he returned, there was a small package on his pillow. No note, no label, just a plain brown wrapping. Ron stared at it suspiciously for a full minute before carefully unwrapping it, like it might bite. Inside was a simple worn leather bracelet, thin and plain. Ron frowned. Then he noticed the charm woven into it, so subtle it barely glimmered. He touched it and felt a faint warmth. A protective charm, not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Ron swallowed. Fred and George didn't do steady unless it mattered. He slipped the bracelet onto his wrist and stared at it, feeling something warm and heavy settle in his chest.
He didn't tell them. He knew they'd never admit it.
But the next morning, at breakfast, he deliberately rested his wrist on the table where they could see it. Fred's eyes flicked to it. George's eyes flicked too. Neither of them said a word, but George's mouth twitched upward just slightly, and Fred, when he passed Ron the jam, patted Ron's shoulder once, quick and rough and casual, as if it meant nothing. It meant everything. Then the day came. Not the day of the train yet. Tomorrow was the train, but the day before. The last full day at the burrow. Ron woke early, heart thudding, because his body had decided it didn't know how to sleep when something big was coming. Downstairs, Molly was already awake, already moving, already trying to make the kitchen normal, and failing because there was nothing normal about the air. Breakfast happened in a strange quiet. Even Fred and George were subdued, which was unsettling in its own way. Ginny barely ate. Percy kept glancing at Ron like he was trying to memorize him. Arthur finally cleared his throat and said, "Right, I took the day off." Molly blinked. "You did?" Arthur nodded, looking almost shy. "Thought we'd do something together," he said, "as a family." Molly's face softened immediately. "Oh." Ron looked up. "What kind of something?" Arthur smiled. "The orchard," he said. Picnic. Flying, whatever we like. Molly instantly reached for a basket. "I'll pack lunch." So they went. They walked along the path through the field, the burrow behind them, the orchard ahead. Apple trees and pear trees and wild grass. The air smelled like late summer, warm and green. Ginny walked beside Ron, kicking small stones along the path, pretending she was fine. Ron watched her for a while, then bumped her shoulder gently. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Ginny's voice was small. "No." Ron's chest tightened. Ginny continued quickly, like she needed to get it out before she changed her mind. "I'm happy for you," she said, "and jealous and sad, and proud and annoyed, and and everything." Ron snorted softly. "That's a lot," Ginny nodded fiercely. "That's what happens when people leave." Ron swallowed. "I'm not leaving forever." Ginny kicked another stone. "I know," she said, "but it's still leaving." Ron didn't have a perfect answer, so he did what he could. He said, "Next year, you'll be there too." Ginny's mouth tightened, and she nodded once like she was clinging to it. "Next year," she repeated softly. The orchard was bright with sun and dappled shade. Molly spread blankets. Arthur adjusted a few branches with careful wand work, muttering about over-enthusiastic apples that had developed an unfortunate habit of dropping at the worst moment. Fred produced a quaffle, because of course he did. George produced another, because of course he did. They played a chaotic, laughing game that barely resembled proper Quidditch but felt perfect anyway. Ron flew on an old family broom, its handle worn smooth, its speed not impressive, but it was familiar and steady beneath him. He soared above the trees and felt the rush of air, the sun on his face, the sound of his family laughing below. Up here, for a moment, Hogwarts felt far away. It was just flying, just home. When they finally collapsed onto the blankets, breathless and sweating, Molly's picnic basket proved, as always, to contain enough food to feed an army. Sandwiches, fruit, crisps, pumpkin juice, something sweet for later. They ate until Ron thought he might burst, then lay back with the grass tickling his fingers and the sky stretched wide above him. Arthur sat up, elbows on his knees, looking around at all of them. He looked happy and sad and proud, all at once. Tomorrow, Arthur said quietly. The word landed in the middle of them like a stone dropped into still water. Ron's stomach tightened. Ginny's hand twitched, then curled into her own sleeve. Molly's eyes shimmered. Percy straightened automatically, like the word tomorrow had triggered a sense of responsibility. Fred and George went unusually quiet. Arthur reached for Molly's hand and squeezed it. Tomorrow, Arthur repeated softer. Ron steps into something new. Ron swallowed, trying not to let his fear show. He stared up at the sky, the drifting clouds, the blue so wide it made him feel small. He thought of the train, the platform, the barrier, the castle, the sorting hat, the possibility of being placed somewhere he didn't expect, the possibility of being brilliant, the possibility of being ordinary, the possibility of failing, the possibility of finding something that belonged to him. He felt all of it at once, tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate it. And then Ginny, quiet beside him, leaned in and whispered, "Promise me again." Ron turned his head. Her eyes were fierce and watery. "Promise you'll write," she said. "Promise you won't pretend everything's fine if it's not." Ron's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "I promise," he said softly. "I'll write you everything, even the hard stuff." Ginny exhaled, shoulders loosening just a bit. "Good," she whispered, because if Ron was going to leave, Ginny needed something solid to hold on to. And Ron realized he needed it too, a promise that home wasn't disappearing, just stretching. That night, back at the burrow, everyone moved around each other like they were trying not to bump into the feelings filling the rooms. Molly insisted on one last proper dinner. Fred and George made jokes that weren't quite as sharp as usual. Percy offered advice that was quieter than usual. Arthur told a story about his own first night before Hogwarts, voice warm and gentle. Ginny sat close to Ron, elbow pressed against his, like she was making sure he didn't drift too far away before morning. When Ron finally went upstairs, his room looked exactly the same. And yet, it felt like a place he was already leaving. His trunk was by the door. His school robes hung neatly from the wardrobe. Scabbers sat in his travel cage, restless for once, as if he could sense change. Ron sat on his bed and stared at everything. Then there was a soft knock at the door. Ron's heart jumped. "Come in," he said quietly. Ginny slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her. She looked small in the dim light. She didn't speak at first. She just walked to the edge of Ron's bed and sat down, hands folded tightly in her lap, like she was holding herself together. Ron waited. Finally, Ginny whispered, "I hate this part." Ron's chest tightened. "Me too," Ginny swallowed. "I want you to be excited," she said. "I want you to have everything. I want you to go and be brilliant. But I also want," her voice faltered. Ron's throat tightened. "You want me to stay?" Ginny nodded, tears shining. Ron didn't know what to do with that. So he did the simplest thing. He reached out and took her hand. They sat like that for a long time, saying nothing, just holding on to each other in the quiet of the room. Eventually, Ginny wiped her face quickly, like she was annoyed at herself. "Write me," she said again, voice fierce, like repeating it could protect her. Ron nodded. "I will." Ginny stood abruptly, as if standing would stop her from crying again. She paused at the door. Then she turned back and said, softer this time, "Good night, Ron." Ron's throat tightened. "Good night, Gin." After she left, Ron lay down with both wands tucked safely under his pillow, his own and Charlie's repaired one, and stared into the darkness. He couldn't sleep. He kept imagining the barrier at King's Cross. He kept imagining the moment his feet would step onto a platform that wasn't quite in the normal world. He kept imagining the train, the strangers, the start of everything. And beneath it all, he kept hearing Ginny's voice. "Write me everything." Ron finally whispered into the dark, as if saying it could make it true. "I will." And at some point, without noticing, he fell asleep. Morning came too fast. Ron woke to the smell of bacon and toast, and Molly's voice moving briskly through the house like she was trying to outrun the day. He dressed quickly, hands shaking slightly. Downstairs, the kitchen was bright and too loud, and too quiet all at once. Molly had made a breakfast that felt like a celebration and a shield. Arthur sat at the table, hair slightly askew, glasses crooked, watching Ron with a softness that made Ron's throat tighten. Percy sat upright, neat, composed, like he was trying to be a stable presence. Fred and George sat together, exchanging glances that suggested plans in motion, but also something quieter underneath. Ginny sat at the end of the table, pale, silent, eyes fixed on Ron like she was trying to burn him into her memory. Ron sat down in his usual chair. It felt strange, like sitting in it was already becoming a past thing. "Eat," Molly said immediately. "Proper breakfast, you'll need it." Ron nodded and ate. He barely tasted anything. Time moved. The trunk was dragged downstairs. Molly checked it 3 more times. Arthur carried it like it weighed nothing, because he refused to let Ron struggle with it. Outside, the morning air was crisp. The sky was bright. Too bright. It didn't feel like a day that should contain goodbyes. The family gathered near the garden gate. The car sat ready. Arthur's enchanted muggle car, looking ordinary and not ordinary at all, waiting to take them to the station. Molly fussed with Ron's collar. Ron tried to stand still. Ginny hovered at his side, silent. Percy cleared his throat like he was about to give a speech. Fred and George watched Ron with matching expressions that were oddly hard to read. Arthur rested a hand on Ron's shoulder, and then Molly, very suddenly, pulled Ron into a hug so tight it felt like she was trying to press him back into childhood. She whispered, "My baby." Ron's face burned. He hugged her back anyway, because he wanted to, because he needed to. Molly pulled back, eyes wet, then immediately wiped them, as if offended by her own tears. "Right," she said briskly. "Let's go." And just like that, Ron stepped toward the car, toward the road, toward King's Cross. Toward the first real edge of everything.